In the year 970, on the small island of Gotland, in the cold middle of the Baltic Sea, a farmer walked out to a stone wall at the edge of his field, lifted a flat slab of limestone, and buried 2 great chests beneath it. Inside those chests were more than 14,000 coins, most of them silver, most of them minted in cities he had almost certainly never seen with his own eyes: Baghdad, Damascus, Samarkand, 3,000 miles away from a man standing in the snow on a Baltic island. But here is the part that still puzzles historians. He never came back. The silver lay under that wall for 1,029 years, until a farmer with a metal detector found it in 1999. And the man who buried it, who he was, where he went, what he had been afraid of that morning, we will never know. To understand him, to understand how a Norse farmer came to be sitting on a hoard of Arabic silver in a quiet Baltic field, we have to leave this place. We have to travel west and back, 100 years back, to a fjord on the western coast of Norway, where the answer to our farmer's silver is already taking shape, though no one there knows it yet. Before we settle in, if you enjoy what we do here, a like or subscribe genuinely helps us keep making these. And if you have Scandinavian heritage, or remember stories your parents or grandparents told you about the old country, I would be honored if you shared them down in the comments. Tonight, we are going to spend the long evening with the people we call the Vikings, though they did not call themselves that, and as we will see, most of them were nothing like the picture we have inherited from books and screens. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 2. A farm by the fjord. His name is Thorfinn Halldórsson. He is 38 years old, which in his world makes him an older man, not yet old, but no longer young. He has been awake for perhaps a quarter of an hour. There is no morning bell in his life, no cockerel calling on cue, no clock to consult. He woke because the fire on the hearth had burned low, and the cold under the wool blanket had begun, very politely, to remind him of itself. He swung his legs down onto the packed earth floor. He pulled on his trousers, his tunic, his leg bindings. He stepped over his sleeping son, his sleeping daughter, his wife, who is not quite sleeping but is not yet ready to be awake either, and he walked to the door. Now he stands in it, looking out. The first thing he must do before water, before food, before anything else is the fire. The fire is not a convenience in his house. The fire is the house. If the fire dies in the night, the family wakes cold. The cooking is delayed, the day begins behind. More than that, restarting a Viking Age hearth from nothing was a long and irritating piece of work, involving a fire steel, a flint, and a small bundle of charred linen tinder. And Thorfinn has done it enough times in his life to have developed strong opinions about the difference between a properly banked fire and a lazy one. He kneels at the hearth. He blows softly across the embers, not hard, the way an impatient man would, but slow and steady, the way you breathe on a sleeping animal you do not want to startle. A gray skin of ash lifts and parts, and underneath, the red eye of last night's fire is still there, waiting. He feeds it a sliver of dry pine, then another. The flame catches. The hall begins very slowly to warm. This is the first thing to understand about Thorfinn, and the thing that is going to feel strangest to anyone who learned about Vikings from films, novels, or a vaguely remembered chapter from a school textbook. Thorfinn is a Viking, by which we mean he is a Norse-speaking man living in Scandinavia during the period we call the Viking Age, roughly 790 to 1066. But he is not, in any sense that would be useful to you, a raider. He has never raided anyone. He has never set foot on a longship pointed at England. He does not own a sword. He owns an axe, which he uses to split wood for the hearth he just lit, and a long knife on his belt, which he uses to gut fish, cut rope, and trim leather. The most violent thing he has done in the last decade was hit a thief on the ear with the flat of an oar. This will surprise you, but it should not, because the truth of the Viking Age is that the overwhelming majority of the people we now call Vikings, somewhere north of 9 in every 10 of them, were exactly what Thorfinn is. They were farmers. They lived their entire lives on small holdings like this one, on the edge of a fjord or a lake or a forest clearing, watching the same dozen cattle grow old, splitting the same firewood every autumn, harvesting the same thin strips of barley in the same short northern summer, and dying, almost always, within a few miles of where they were born. Behind him, in the longhouse, his wife is now properly awake. Her name is Sigrid, and she is, in a way that we will need to spend some time understanding tonight, the more powerful of the two of them. Not in war, which has not visited this fjord in living memory, not in law, where she is, in theory, subordinate to him, but in the daily, hourly, week-by-week running of everything that keeps this household alive, Sigrid is in command, and everyone in the house, including Thorfinn, knows it. The iron ring of keys hanging from her belt is the visible sign of it. Those keys open the food chests, the linen chests, the locked store room, where the year's salt and the year's barley, and the year's careful little hoards of dried fish and smoked mutton are kept. If you want to understand Norse society and you do not want to read a textbook about it, those keys are a good place to start. A married woman in Thorfinn's world is called a husfreyja, a house mistress, and the keys are her badge of office. She received them on her wedding day. They were handed over to her in front of witnesses by her husband's mother. When Sigrid married Thorfinn, she walked into this longhouse, and the older woman, who had been husfreyja before her, took the iron ring off her own belt, placed it in Sigrid's hand, and walked out to live with a married daughter on the next farm. It was not symbolic. It was a transfer of power. From that day, anything that came out of those chests came out because Sigrid said so. There are 3 children stirring on the platform behind her. The 2 boys, Halldor and Eyvind, are 11 and 7. The little girl, Aslaug, is 4, and would like to stay under the sheepskin if at all possible. Thank you. None of them will get away with that for very long. There is work, there is always work. And even the 4-year-old has small tasks within her reach. She will help her mother carry kindling. She will help feed the orphaned lamb that has been overwintering by the hearth, much to the cat's professional disapproval. None of this is cruelty. It is the entirely normal arrangement of a household where every hand counts, where idleness is not a moral failing so much as a practical impossibility, and where children learn how the world works by doing it, badly at first, alongside the adults who love them. Thorfinn pulls his cloak around his shoulders and takes 2 empty buckets down off the wall by the door. There is a small freshwater spring, perhaps 200 paces down the path, between the longhouse and the fjord shore. The fjord water itself is salt useful for many things, but not for drinking, not for cooking, not for the porridge that is about to be Sigrid's first project of the day. He sets off down the path. The buckets bang gently against his knees as he walks. The cold air comes into his lungs in a way that, after 38 years of mornings like this one, he does not particularly notice anymore. At the spring he kneels. Before he dips the bucket in, he pauses for the smallest fraction of a second and touches 2 fingers to a small wooden disc tucked into a niche in the stones. The disc is the size of a coin. It has been there longer than Thorfinn has. His father put it there when Thorfinn was a boy. It is meant for the Landvættir, the land spirits, the small invisible neighbors who, according to the older people of this fjord, share the spring with the family, and who would prefer to be acknowledged rather than ignored. Thorfinn does not give the matter much conscious thought. It is, to him, the way you greet someone you have known your whole life. You do it because it is rude not to. Whether the spirits are listening is a question for priests, poets, and the kind of restless young men who have time to argue about such things at a winter feast. When he gets back, the morning porridge is already in motion. Sigrid is pouring the water he brought into a soapstone pot suspended over the hearth on an iron chain. The pot is dark, with the soot of years. The porridge will be barley meal, slowly cooked, eventually flavored with a knob of butter from the cool store, and, if the children are very lucky, a small pour of honey from the wooden box on the highest shelf, which is locked, because honey in this household is treated as something between a foodstuff and a sacrament. The porridge will be eaten with a wooden spoon out of a wooden bowl, sitting at the long table that has been pulled out from the side platform for the morning meal. There will be no surprise. There has not been a surprise about morning porridge in this house for 15 years. That is not, in their view, a complaint about the porridge. There are 7 people at the table this morning. The 5 members of the family, and 2 others, a man called Ulf and a woman called Hild. Ulf and Hild eat from the same kind of wooden bowls as everyone else, with the same spoons, the same porridge. They are not, however, members of the family. They are thralls, the Norse word that we translate, accurately enough, as slaves. And here is where the story of the Viking Age becomes something more complicated than the heroic version, and where any honest account of these people, including this one, has to slow down and tell the truth. Slavery is woven through Thorfinn's world from one end to the other. It is not, in his society, a controversial institution. It is not debated. It is not concealed. It is simply the way things are. Almost every farm of any size in Scandinavia in the year 870 has at least one thrall working on it. Larger farms might have a dozen. Royal estates might have 100. The thralls cut the wood, dig the peat, spread the manure, mind the cattle, weave the rougher cloth, and do the back-breaking everyday labor that allows the free family, the bondir, as people like Thorfinn are called, to maintain their own dignity by doing only the more skilled or more visible work. Ulf was born to thrall parents on a neighboring farm and was sold to Thorfinn's father 12 years ago. Hild was captured as a child, somewhere on the coast of what is now Ireland, in a raid Thorfinn himself had nothing to do with. She has lived in this longhouse for 18 years. She speaks Norse without an accent. She remembers almost nothing of her first language and only fragments of her mother's face. We will talk later tonight about how the Norse slave trade actually worked, because to understand why our Gotland farmer was sitting on Baghdad silver, we eventually have to understand who exactly was being bought and sold along the rivers of Russia, and why. We will get there, but tonight, you should know that this is not a footnote to the Viking story. It is not a guilty paragraph tucked into a longer celebration of Longships. It is one of the engines of the whole Viking Age, and the woman quietly eating porridge at the lower end of Thorfinn's table is, in her own quiet way, the part of the story that the heroic version most often leaves out. After the bowls are cleared, Thorfinn and Sigrid sit for a few minutes longer at the table and have what, in a modern household, you would call a meeting. They do not call it that. They would not have a word for it. But that is what it is. They go through what needs to happen today, and they divide it. The cow that has been favoring her left front leg needs to be looked at. Thorfinn will do that. The barley in the small upper field needs to be turned for drying before the rain, that the color of the sky over the ridge is quietly suggesting will arrive by afternoon. Ulf and the older boy will see to that. The loom on which Sigrid has been working for 3 months is at the stage where she needs a long, uninterrupted morning of weaving, so the younger boy will mind the 4-year-old and the orphaned lamb. Hild will start the day's milk going into cheese in the cool back of the longhouse. The fishing line that Thorfinn set in the fjord overnight will be lifted before the wind picks up. It is, all things considered, a fairly ordinary morning. Here is what you should hold in your mind as we let Thorfinn and his family disperse to their morning's tasks. This farm, this small, weather-beaten, hard-working, perfectly unremarkable Norwegian farm is the foundation of the entire Viking Age. Everything we are about to spend the rest of tonight talking about: the Longships, the trade routes, the colonies in Iceland and Greenland, the slave markets at Hedeby, the Varangian guard in the marble corridors of the imperial palace in Constantinople, the silver chests of the man on Gotland, all of it begins here, on land like this, in households like this. The farms came first. The farms paid for everything. Without Thorfinn's barley, and Sigrid's cheese, and Ulf's chopped wood, and Hild's quietly competent hands at the loom, none of the rest of the story can happen. Most of what Thorfinn is going to do today is going to look very, very familiar to anyone who grew up on a farm in the early or middle part of the 20th century. If your grandparents kept dairy cattle in Minnesota, or your father grew up on a smallholding in Yorkshire, or your mother remembers feeding chickens on a hardscrabble place outside Lethbridge in 1946, you would recognize most of Thorfinn's morning. The tools are simpler, the buildings are smaller, the clothes are heavier and itchier, but the rhythm is the same. The animals do not wait. The weather does not wait. The work begins before the light is good and continues until the light is gone, and then for a few hours longer by the firelight, because there is mending to do, and rope to splice, and porridge to be stirred for tomorrow's breakfast that needs to be soaked in cold water tonight, or it will not cook properly in the morning. The fish that Thorfinn lifts onto the flat shore stone an hour later, 2 large cod, gleaming pewter gray in the cold light, are not, in his mind, a small thing. Cod is one of the foundations of his entire economic life. Properly split, gutted, and hung up on the high wooden drying frames behind the longhouse, exposed to the cold, dry winds of a Norwegian winter, those 2 fish will become something called stockfish. And stockfish is the closest thing the Viking Age has to a perfect food. It keeps for years. It is light. It is rich in protein. It can be carried on a longship without rotting. It can be traded inland for silver or grain or amber or any number of other things that a Norwegian farmer cannot grow on his own slope. Every cod that Thorfinn lifts out of the fjord is, in a very real sense, a small unit of stored wealth that can be moved. If you had told Thorfinn that, 3 centuries after his death, dried Norwegian cod from racks like the ones behind his longhouse would still be one of the most important export commodities of the entire North Atlantic, still being shipped from Bergen to merchants in Bruges and London and Bordeaux, still feeding monasteries and armies and fishing villages thousands of miles from the cold fjord he is standing on, he would not have believed you. He would have laughed and gone back to splitting his fish. But this is what we are going to have to keep coming back to tonight. Things happen on this farm, small, ordinary, repetitive things that, multiplied across 10,000 farms exactly like it, are quietly changing the shape of the world. Inside the longhouse, Sigrid is at her loom. This is the moment of the morning she has been looking forward to since she woke, and she would not say so aloud, because it would feel slightly indulgent to admit. The loom is a tall wooden frame leaning against the wall, almost as high as the rafters. From the top crossbar hang dozens of undyed wool warp threads, weighted at the bottom by smooth oblong stones. each about the size of a small loaf of bread. Between her fingers passes the weft, a softer thread, sometimes undyed, sometimes the muted soft red of madder root, sometimes the faded blue of woad, and she lifts the warp, slips the weft through, lets the warp fall, beats it up tight with a wooden sword-shaped beater, and lifts again. She has done this so many times that her hands do not require her attention. They go on without her. Chapter 3. At the Loom, How Norse Wool Built the Longships. The shuttle passes between her fingers, and her hands do not need her. She has been weaving since she was 9 years old. The first cloth she ever made was a mitten, badly. Her mother kept it. It is in a chest somewhere on a farm 2 valleys to the north, where Sigrid was born, and where her younger sister now keeps house with a man Sigrid has met perhaps 4 times in 15 years. The mitten was uneven, the thumb came out too small, and one of the cuffs had a knot in it that nobody could quite explain. Her mother praised it, hung it by the fire, and made her start another one the next day. That is, more or less, how Viking Age girls learned to weave. By doing it badly until they did it well, and then by doing it well for the rest of their lives. The little girl on the sheepskin is at the very beginning of this same long road. Hild has placed a pair of wooden carding combs in her hands and shown her, slowly, how to pull a small handful of raw fleece through the teeth to draw the fibers straight. Aslaug is taking this very seriously. Her hands are too small for the combs. Her tongue is sticking slightly out of the side of her mouth. The fleece, as far as anyone can tell, is becoming more tangled rather than less. Hild is not correcting her. She is letting the 4-year-old make her 4-year-old version of the work, the same way Sigrid's mother once let her make her terrible mitten. That mitten was never the point. The point was the next 40,000 mittens, and the cloaks, and the dresses, and the blankets, and the sails. And the sails. Because here is one of the quiet truths of the Viking Age that, if you were not paying attention, you might miss entirely. The famous Longships, the dragon-prowed vessels, we will spend the second half of tonight talking about. The ones that carried Norse warriors to Lindisfarne and Paris, and the Black Sea, those ships are useless without a sail. A longship, without its sail, is just a very long, very slim rowing boat. And at 30 oars, she could make perhaps 3 or 4 miles an hour with a fresh crew. A longship with her sails set, on a steady wind, could make 10, 11, 12 miles an hour for days at a time. The sail is everything. The sail is what makes Norse seafaring possible at intercontinental scale, and the sail is made of wool. The cloth on the bench beside Sigrid has a name. It is called vadmal. It is a heavy, slightly oily, wonderfully durable woolen weave that the Norse will eventually use as a kind of standardized currency. Lengths of vadmal are measured in ells and traded for everything: for fish, for iron, for grain, for honey, for the rent on a farm, for the dowry of a daughter, for the price of a slave. A single sail for a working longship, and we know this from modern experimental archaeology, where people have actually woven and tested them, required somewhere between 40 and 70 square yards of vadmal. To produce that much cloth, working full-time, took a single skilled weaver about 3 years. We will return to longships in detail later tonight to how they were built, how they sailed, how the famous dragon prows were carved and what they were meant to do, and how a Norse navigator without a compass managed to find the same square mile of Icelandic coast year after year across 600 miles of open Atlantic. But you should hold this thought while we are still at Sigrid's loom, and the sail is still very small in the corner of our vision. The image of the Viking Age is the warrior in the prow of the ship. The reality of the Viking Age is the woman at the loom, whose 3 years of work hangs above his head and catches the wind. Without her, he is not going anywhere. Without 10,000 of her, scattered across 10,000 farms exactly like this one, there is no Viking Age at all. At the cool back end of the longhouse, Hild has gone into the storeroom. This is the room with the lock on the door, the room whose key hangs from Sigrid's belt, the room that is the single most important piece of architecture in the family's life. The storeroom is the difference between living through winter and not living through winter, and everyone in the household understands this from a very early age. Inside, the air is several degrees cooler than the rest of the longhouse. It smells of smoke, salt, and old fat, in roughly that order. Above her hang 2 cured legs of last spring's mutton and one rather modest side of bacon that the family is rationing very carefully. On the shelves are 3 wheels of cheese in various stages of maturity. In the barrels is fermented cabbage, soured milk, and salted fish. In the sacks against the wall is the rest of the barley harvest, which will need to last until the next 9.5 months from now. On the very highest shelf, in 3 small soapstone vessels with carefully tied linen covers, are the precious things. Honey, gathered last summer from a hollow tree 2 valleys over that the family has, by long tradition, the right to harvest. Salt, which the family does not produce themselves, and which they buy each year from a man who comes up the fjord in a small boat from a village on the more southern coast, where the sun is generous enough to evaporate seawater in pans. And butter, packed under a thin layer of brine, which is how the Viking world keeps butter from going off when there is no refrigeration and no plastic, and very little in the way of cool basements. These 3 things, honey, salt, and butter, are what turn the heavy winter porridge from food into something you might actually want to eat. Chapter 4. The Upper Field. Barley, Stone, and the Boy. Up the slope, in the small terraced field that climbs the lower side of the ridge, Ulf and the older boy are turning barley. The barley has been cut and stooked in tippy-shaped clusters of sheaves, leaning against simple wooden tripods, drying in the cold, dry air. Every day or 2, it needs to be restacked, the inner sheaves brought to the outside and the outer brought to the inside, so that the grain dries evenly and does not begin in damp pockets, the slow process of going moldy that ruins a year of work in a week. This is one of the small, relentless agricultural facts of life in the North. Things that grow do not necessarily want to be eaten, and a great deal of human effort goes into persuading them to make themselves available. Ulf is teaching the boy how to tell whether a head of barley is properly dry, and the boy is listening with the seriousness of someone being initiated into a serious adult mystery, which is in fact what is happening. Ulf rolls a head between his palms. He blows the chaff away. He picks one grain out of the resulting heap and bites it gently between his front teeth. There is a particular small crisp sound it makes when it is ready. There is a slightly softer, slightly resistant sound it makes when it is not. The boy tries the same thing. The grain in his teeth makes the wrong sound. Ulf nods and says nothing. The boy will try again tomorrow. The low stone wall that runs along the upper edge of this field is, in its own quiet way, the deed to the property. There are no parchment titles in Thorfinn's world. There is no land registry. There is, instead, the wall. Thorfinn's grandfather laid the first courses of these stones in a summer almost a century ago. His father added to them and shifted them. Thorfinn himself has spent some part of every spring he can remember crouched over them, fitting fallen stones back into place after frost, and roots and the occasional bored sheep have worked them loose. The wall says without a single written word that everything inside it belongs to this family, and that everything outside it does not. Anyone who tries to argue otherwise will find themselves in front of an assembly at midsummer that takes such arguments extremely seriously. Halldór is 11. He has been 11 for 2 months. In a Norse household of this period, 11 is not quite a child anymore. He still sleeps with his brother and sister on the family platform. He still has the small carved wooden horse his grandfather made for him when he was 4. But he has begun, in the last year, to be sent out with the men. He has begun to be given small responsibilities that come with small consequences if he fails them. He is, very slowly, in a way no one in the family will mark with any ceremony, becoming the next farmer of this farm. Or perhaps something else. Because boys like Halldór, in the year 870, do sometimes become something else. He is looking this morning at the gap at the mouth of the fjord. That gap, where the steep cliffs on either side narrow and then suddenly open, is where the fjord meets the open sea. Beyond it, somewhere over the dark gray water, are the islands they call the Sudreyjar in Norse, the Hebrides, and beyond those, places he has only heard about. England, Francia, the cities the older men speak of in winter after the second cup. He cannot quite picture them. He has never seen a town larger than the trading beach at Skiringsal, and that was when he was 8. But sometimes, not often, and not when his father is watching, he thinks about the gap and about what is on the other side of it. And we will return to what he is thinking about, because in some version of his life in 20 years' time, this same boy will be standing at the prow of a ship in that very gap. Not yet, but not impossible. Chapter 5. A cow, a path, and a stranger by the shore. Down at the byre, Thorfinn has the lame cow. Her name is Brunka, a name that means more or less brownie, and she is one of 6 cows the family owns. To the modern ear, 6 cows does not sound like much of a herd. In the year 870, on a Norwegian fjord-side farm of this size, 6 cows is a perfectly respectable number, and the loss of even one of them would be a real blow to the household's prospects for the winter. Cattle, in Thorfinn's world, are not just animals. They are walking, breathing capital. They are also, in a way that the English language has preserved in fossil form, the measure of wealth. Our word fee comes from an older Norse and Germanic word for cattle, and so does pecuniary, by way of the Latin pecus. To have cattle was to have money. Even now, on Thorfinn's farm, you could trade Brunka for roughly the price of a half-decent sword. He runs his thumb gently along the underside of Brunka's hoof. He has done this many times before in his life. So did his father. So did his grandfather. There is a small piece of grit, a sharp pebble, no bigger than a peppercorn, wedged into the cleft of the hoof, in just the spot where it would press painfully on the soft tissue every time the cow took a step. He works it out, slowly, with the tip of a horn-handled knife. The cow makes a small, unimpressed noise. He puts the hoof down. She shifts her weight onto it, experimentally, and decides that it is now acceptable. The whole intervention has taken perhaps 2 minutes. It is the kind of small, undramatic competence that holds a Norse farm together, the ability to look at a slightly lame cow and know whether the answer is a pebble, a strain, a hoof rot, or the much worse thing that no amount of cleverness can fix. He comes out of the byre wiping his hands on the front of his tunic, which is the kind of household habit Sigrid has been trying to break him of for 15 years, and which has, so far, proven remarkably resilient. And as he straightens up in the doorway, he sees something at the lower end of the path that catches his attention. A figure. A single figure, walking up from the fjord shore. Not a member of the household. Not one of the boys from the next farm. A stranger. strangers, in the year 870, on a Norwegian fjord that sees perhaps a dozen unfamiliar faces in any given year, are an event. They are not necessarily a worrying event. Thorfinn is not reaching for his axe, but they are an event. The first thing Thorfinn does, by old habit, is take a careful look at the man's clothing. The cloak is heavier than a farmer's. The boots are too good for an itinerant beggar. The brooch is plain bronze, not silver, but the weave of the cloak suggests its owner has been somewhere where finer cloth was on offer. The walking staff is ash, polished smooth in the middle from years of use. The satchel is small but well made. All of this, in about 3 seconds, tells Thorfinn that the man coming up his path is most likely a farmader, a traveling trader, and probably not a dangerous one. The traveler stops a polite distance away. He raises his right hand, palm open, in the small ancient gesture that means, in this part of the world and in this period, exactly what it would mean almost anywhere else. I am not holding a weapon. I am not here to hurt you. He calls out a greeting. Thorfinn returns it. The two men close the remaining distance and stand for a moment in the way two strangers stand, who have never seen each other before, but who already know, by clothing and posture and the careful, steady pace of the approach, that the next 10 minutes are going to be civil. And this small civility the traveler approaches openly. The householder receives him without weapon in hand, is itself one of the small unwritten laws of the Viking world. Hospitality in Norse society is not a virtue. It is an obligation. It is so deep an obligation that it has its own poem. By the time the two men have walked the remaining 30 paces up the path, Sigrid is in the doorway of the longhouse. She has heard her husband's voice take on the particular careful warmth that, in 15 years of marriage, she has learned means guest. She has wiped her hands. She has straightened her headcloth. She has not yet set out food, but in her mind she is already inventorying what is in the storeroom and what is on the fire, and calculating what can be put in front of a stranger that will neither embarrass the household by its meanness nor exhaust their reserves before the long winter. This calculation, in Sigrid's mind, takes about as long as Thorfinn's inspection of the man's boots. By the time the guest reaches the threshold, she has decided. There will be the morning's remaining porridge, warmed and sweetened with a thin pour of honey. There will be a piece of yesterday's cheese. There will be the small wooden cup of barley ale that, in Norse households, takes the place that a handshake takes in ours. The traveler's name, it turns out, is Ketil Asgeirsson. He has come up the fjord from the south, on foot from the small trading beach at the head of the next inlet over, where he has left his pack pony with a cousin. He is on his way north, to a market town that none of you would have heard of, and that, frankly, even most Norwegians of the period would have only heard of vaguely. He is, as Thorfinn guessed, a trader. He carries amber from the Baltic, small bundles of imported linen from somewhere in the south, a handful of glass beads from a workshop in Frisia, a small pouch of silver that he prefers not to mention until he knows his hosts better, and, in the bottom of his satchel, wrapped in a strip of leather, 3 small folded pieces of news. The first piece of news, which he shares while drinking his ale, is that the price of iron at the trading beach has gone up by almost 1/3 since the summer. This is the kind of news that interests Thorfinn directly, because Thorfinn is going to need a new plowshare in the spring, and the cost of a plowshare is roughly the cost of the iron in it, plus the labor of the smith. The second piece of news is that a man 2 valleys north has died, fallen from a roof he was rethatching, leaving a widow and 4 small children, which is the kind of news that, for a Norse household, sets off a quiet calculation about whether anything can be sent. The third piece of news, which Ketil saves for last, and which he delivers in a slightly lower voice, with the wooden cup paused near his mouth, is the one that will, in ways neither he nor Thorfinn yet understand, change the rest of this winter, the next spring, and possibly the rest of Haldor's life. "There is a man," Ketil says, and now Thorfinn and Sigrid are both leaning forward without quite realizing it. There is a man named Ingolfr, of a family they may have heard of in the southern fjords, who has spent the last 2 summers fitting out a ship. Not for raiding, not for trading either exactly, for something else. There is, says Ketil, an island far to the west, beyond the Faroe Islands, beyond even the wild northern fringes of what the Norse already know. A monk who washed up on the Faroes years ago spoke of it. Sailors who were blown off course, coming home from the British Isles, have caught sight of it. It is, by all accounts, an empty land. No one lives there. There is grass enough for cattle. There is fish in the rivers. There is space, endless, unclaimed, unowned space, for any family willing to make the crossing. Ingolfr means to go in the spring. He is taking his wife, his thralls, his livestock, and as many other free farmers and their households as want to come. He is, in other words, looking for settlers. It is a measure of how long Thorfinn and Sigrid have been married that the look they exchange across the table, in the half-second after Ketil says the word settlers, does not require any explanation. They will not discuss it now. They will not discuss it tonight. But each of them knows that, somewhere down the line, perhaps not this year, perhaps not next year, but somewhere in the future that this farm is laying down day by day, they are going to have to talk about it. Because Haldor is the eldest son, and Eyvind, the 7-year-old, is going to need a farm of his own one day. And Norway, for all its long fjords and its rough beauty, and its centuries of Haldorsons and Thorfinnsons walking the same paths down to the same springs, is a country that runs out of farms very fast. By the Loom, the 4-year-old has looked up. She does not know what has been said. She does not know who the stranger is. But she has felt, in the way small children always feel, the small change in the air of the room when adults say something that means more than it sounds like it means. She watches her mother. Her mother is not looking at her. Her mother is very briefly looking at her father. Aslaug returns after a moment to her wool. The fleece in her hands is still very tangled, but she is trying in her 4-year-old way, and Hild is being patient with her, and the fire is warm, and the porridge from this morning is sitting comfortably in her small belly, and the world for her this morning is essentially a good place. We will come back to her later in the night. Because of all the people sitting in this longhouse at this moment, she is the one who, if everything Ketil has just said comes to anything, will live to see most of it. Ketil stays for another hour. He eats his porridge. He eats his cheese. He shows Sigrid, at her quiet but interested request, the small folded square of Frisian linen in his satchel, a piece of cloth so finely woven that she handles it for a long moment, with the expression of a craftswoman looking at the work of a craftsman she will never meet but already respects. She does not buy any. Not today. But she remembers the weave. She runs her thumb across it once more, hands it back, and files away the information that there is, somewhere south of here, a town where weavers are doing work this fine, in case she ever has reason to send a message that way. When Ketil leaves, the household watches him go for perhaps 30 seconds longer than is strictly necessary. He has given them, without quite intending to, 3 small folded pieces of news, 2 of which will affect them within the week, and 1 of which may, or may not, affect them for the rest of their lives. Thorfinn turns back to the byre. Sigrid turns back to the loom. Ulf and Haldor, who have come down from the upper field at the smell of cheese, return to their work. The afternoon continues. The morning's barley turning is now half done. The cow that was lame is no longer lame. The cheese that is starting in the back room is starting. The cloth that is on the loom is 2 inches longer than it was an hour ago. And somewhere in the back of every adult head on this farm, a small new thought has been set down on a high shelf, where it will sit for the rest of the autumn, gathering weight. Those of you who served, or who grew up on a farm in the years after the war, or who remember the way news traveled in a small community before telephones and television, when a letter from a brother in Alberta could be read aloud at a kitchen table 6 times in a single evening and reshape the conversations of a household for a month afterwards, will recognize the shape of what has just happened in Thorfinn's longhouse. Important news in places like this does not arrive with a headline. It arrives in the bottom of a satchel between the cheese and the goodbye. And if any of you have stories like that, from your own families or the ones you grew up around, I would be honored to hear them down in the comments later. For now, though, we are going to step back from this farm only briefly, because to understand what Ingolfr is doing, and what Ketil has just brought into Thorfinn's kitchen, we need to understand the slightly larger world this fjord sits inside. Thorfinn's farm is not alone. Up and down this fjord, at intervals of perhaps half a mile to 2 miles, are other farms that look, in their essentials, very much like his own. Some are larger, some are smaller. Some belong to families that have been here for 3 or 4 generations. Some to families that have only arrived in living memory. Together, these scattered farms make up what the Norse call a by-GD, a settled district. The by-GD has its own particular character, its own quiet rivalries, its own shared grazing grounds for the summer high pastures, and its own particular spring at the head of the fjord, where, by old custom, the surrounding farms all draw their drinking water in the very driest weeks of August, when the smaller springs run thin. Thorfinn knows every family in this by-GD by name. He knows whose cow gives the richest milk. He knows whose elder son is, in everyone's quiet opinion, slightly slower-witted than he ought to be at his age. He knows whose daughter is reaching the age where her father will be putting out cautious feelers for a possible marriage. He knows whose grandfather still tells the story, on long winter evenings after the 3rd cup, of the time he sailed as far as the British Isles in his youth, a story that has, over the years, expanded considerably from the version anyone else in the by-GD remembers from the man's actual return. None of this knowledge is written down. None of it needs to be. It lives in the heads of the adults of the district, the way the layout of your hometown lives in yours, even if you have not consciously thought about a particular street in 20 years. Beyond the by-GD, the world widens. There are paths through the forest, well-worn paths that have been there since long before Thorfinn's grandfather, paths that older people in the district will say were laid down by the giants in the morning of the world that link this fjord to the next fjord, and that one to the next, all the way south along the long, jagged Norwegian coast. There are old standing stones at certain crossroads. There are particular trees that are not to be cut down, for reasons that no one in the district can quite articulate any longer, but that everyone respects all the same. There are stretches of forest that, by long agreement, no farm encloses, because they belong to the shared use of the by-GD, and also perhaps to a slightly older arrangement that predates the by-GD itself. Once a year, at midsummer, the men of the by-GD, and certain of the women in their own particular and not quite discussed role, walk down a path of this kind to a clearing exactly like this one. They sit on the stones. They argue, sometimes loudly, about the things that have happened in the district since the last midsummer. Whose pig got into whose barley? Whose son broke whose nose at the autumn feast? And whether that broken nose has yet been adequately compensated for. Whose daughter is to marry, whose son, and what exactly is going to come with her from the one farm to the other. These are the gatherings the Norse call the Thing, usually rendered in English as thing, and they are, in their quiet, argumentative, deeply ordinary way, one of the most important inventions of the Norse world. We will come back to the Thing, including the much larger national Thing that will, by the year 930, be sitting at a place called Þingvellir in the very middle of Iceland. Because to understand what is about to happen in Thorfinn's family, you have to understand what kind of legal world they live inside. For now, hold this picture in your mind. A clearing in the forest. A circle of stones. A long, late afternoon light. And men arguing, in the quiet, measured way of farmers who have known each other their entire lives, about a pig. Chapter 6. South to Hedeby, the town where the silver came from. While the men of Thorfinn's Bajidi are arguing about pigs at the Midsummer Assembly, 800 miles south of them, at the very base of the Jutland Peninsula, on the shore of a shallow inlet that opens into the Baltic, there is a place that would scarcely make any sense to Thorfinn at all. Its name is Hedeby. To his eye, if he were ever to stand on the hill above it, and he never will, Hedeby would look less like a town than like a small disorderly army that had decided, for reasons of its own, to camp on a beach and never move on. There are between 1,000 and 1,500 people living in Hedeby at any given time. By modern standards, that is barely a small town. By the standards of the Norse world in the year 870, it is something close to a metropolis. There is no other place in Scandinavia like it. There are perhaps 2 or 3 other places in the entire Norse-speaking world that come close Birka in the lake country of central Sweden, Kopang on the western Fjord, Ribe on the western coast of Jutland. These are the towns. Everywhere else in the Viking world, including almost every place we have so far seen tonight, is countryside. What makes Hedeby strange is not its size. What makes it strange is what is in it. Walk down the main plank-laid street this morning in the year 870, and within 5 minutes you will hear Norse, Frisian, Saxon, Slavic, Old Frankish, and if you are lucky, and the wind is in the right direction from a particular merchant stall in the southern quarter, Arabic. You will see a smith hammering iron next door to a weaver whose loom holds cloth dyed with imported pigments from somewhere beyond the Mediterranean. You will see Christian crosses worn around the same necks as small silver hammers of Thor sometimes, in the case of certain practical-minded traders, the two on the same chain. The smell of the place, by mid-morning, is a cocktail of wood smoke, tanned leather, drying fish, ox dung, wet wool, hot iron, fresh bread, and the particular thick linoleum and urine reek of a working dye pot, all overlaid with the salt of the inlet. It is, in its own way, unforgettable. In the workshop quarter, at the doorway of a small timber building with its shutters thrown back, a woman is sorting amber. Her name is Astrid Asbjarnardóttir. She is 41 years old. She has lived in Hedeby for almost 20 of those years. She came here from a farm in southern Norway, a farm not unlike Thorfinn's, in fact. Though larger as a young woman of 22, the second wife of a man who was a trader in amber and walrus ivory, and who, 3 years after their marriage, drowned crossing the inlet in a small boat in weather he should not have been crossing it in. Astrid, finding herself widowed at 25 in a town where she knew perhaps a dozen people by name, did not go home. She did not have any particular reason to go home. The farm in Norway had passed to her older brother, who had 3 sons of his own and who would have made room for her, with politeness, the way one makes room for a piece of furniture one did not order. Astrid did not particularly wish to be a piece of furniture. She stayed. She kept her husband's trade. This is the first surprising thing about Astrid, and it would have been less surprising in her own world than it sounds in ours. In Norse law, in the year 870, a widow was a legal person in her own right. She could own property, she could conduct business, she could enter into contracts, she could divorce a second husband if he turned out to be a disappointment, and she could keep her own goods when she did. A married woman's keys we have already met on Sigrid's belt. A widowed woman's keys were arguably more powerful still, because there was no husband in the picture to defer to even formally. Norse widows ran farms. They ran ships occasionally. They ran businesses. Astrid runs an amber workshop and a quiet, careful import operation. And after 20 years of doing it, she is, though she would never say so aloud, one of the better-known dealers in finished amber on this stretch of the Baltic. Amber is one of those things that, once you understand it, helps the rest of the Viking trade story fall into place. It comes out of the southern Baltic. Specifically, it washes up on the shores of what is now the coast of Poland, Lithuania, and the Russian Kaliningrad region, fossilized tree resin, 50 million years old, the color of warmed honey in good pieces, and the color of mud in bad ones. The Slavic peoples who lived on those coasts had been gathering it and trading it inland for centuries before the Norse arrived. Astrid does not gather her own amber. She buys it, in bulk, from Slavic suppliers who bring it overland and by river to Hedeby. She sorts it, she grades it. She has it polished by a man whose workshop is across the street, into beads, pendants, charms, gaming pieces, and the occasional larger ornament. And then she sells it. She sells it to other Norse merchants going north into Scandinavia. She sells it to Frisian merchants going south into Francia. She sells it, sometimes, to the men with the folded headcloths and the dark robes, the men from the south, whose silver coins she has on certain weeks accepted in exchange. And here is where, finally, we begin to see the answer to the question we opened with tonight. The question of how a Norse farmer on a quiet Baltic island ended up burying 14,000 coins under a stone wall. Those coins did not arrive by accident. They arrived because of women like Astrid, and men like the ones standing across the street from her workshop right now, and a trade network that, by the late 9th century, stretched in an unbroken line of barter and silver from the cold workshops of Hedeby to the marble counting houses of Baghdad. Hold the thread of that question, because we are not at the end of it yet. We are getting closer. But there is one more piece of the puzzle to set in place first, and it is the piece that, more than anything else, paid for that silver, and it is the piece that the heroic version of the Viking story most often refuses to look at directly. Chapter 7. The hard truth at the center of the trade. We come now to a part of the Viking story that an honest historical account cannot skip, and that, out of respect for the people involved and the seriousness of what we are talking about, we will discuss carefully, soberly, and without sensationalism. Slavery, as we touched on this morning at Thorfinn's Longhouse, was woven through Norse society from one end to the other. But the everyday slavery of a family farm, where Ulf or Hild slept on the same long platform as the family and ate the same porridge from the same pot, was only one face of it. There was another face, and it lived in towns like this. It lived in the timber pens at the edge of harbors like Hedeby's. And the existence of that trade, the buying and selling of human beings, is the single most important economic engine of the Viking Age, the thing without which most of the silver, most of the longships, and most of the wealth we associate with this period simply does not exist. The historians who have spent the last 50 years carefully reconstructing this trade have arrived at a picture that is, in its broad shape, not really contested anymore. Norse raiders captured people overwhelmingly in the British Isles, in Ireland, in the coastal regions of what is now France, in the Slavic territories east of the Baltic, in the river valleys of what is now Russia and Ukraine. These captives were not, in the vast majority of cases, kept by the men who took them. They were brought back. They were brought to towns like Hedeby, like Birka, like the great market on the Volkhov River at Staraya Ladoga. And there, in the kind of plank-laid square we are looking at now, they were sold. The buyers were not, mostly, other Norse farmers. The buyers were, mostly, intermediaries, Norse or Slavic or Khazar or Bulgar traders who moved the captives further down the line, along the river systems of Eastern Europe, all the way to the great markets of the Islamic Caliphate. The Caliphate paid in silver. It paid in vast quantities of silver. The dirham mints of Baghdad, Samarkand, Tashkent, and Damascus were, in the 9th and 10th centuries, producing coins on a scale that no other economy in the world could match. The Caliphate needed labor. It needed soldiers. It needed household servants for the great houses of Baghdad and the new capital at Samarra, and it had silver coined, weighed, and verified to pay for them. That silver, paid into the hands of intermediaries on the lower Volga, traveled back north along the river systems, hand to hand, until it ended up in places like Hedeby, in pouches like the one on Astrid's workbench, and on the belts of merchants going home to their farms, including eventually the farm on Gotland where, in the year 970, an unknown man was going to bury 14,000 of those coins under a stone wall and never come back for them. Astrid herself is not, it should be said clearly, a slave trader. There were Norse merchants who specialized in that traffic, and they were a known and identifiable group in Hedeby and Birka, with their own pens and their own warehouses. Astrid is in amber, but Astrid lives in a town whose entire economy floats on the silver that the slave trade brings in, the way a small boat floats on a great cold tide it neither chose nor controls. The coins on her scale are dirhams. They came north because someone, somewhere along the Volga, sold a human being for them. There is no clean money in Hedeby. There is no clean money in most of the Viking trade network at this period. To be a serious merchant in this world is to be, however indirectly, part of a system whose foundations were laid in violence and held up by suffering. The people of Hedeby do not, mostly, discuss this. There is a Frankish theologian 200 miles south of here who has been writing letters condemning Christian merchants who buy and sell pagan captives, and a caliphal jurist in Baghdad, 3,000 miles south of here, who has been writing equally complicated letters about which kinds of human merchandise are permitted under Islamic law and which are not. Astrid has heard of neither of these men, and neither of them has heard of her, and the silver passes between them all the same. We will return later tonight when we follow a longship east along the great river systems of Russia, into the country the Norse called Gardariki, the land of fortresses, to what this trade actually looked like at its far end, in the markets along the Volga, where the Arab geographer Ibn Fadlan would soon write his famous and unflinching account of the Norse merchants he met there. That account, written down in the early 1000s, is one of the most important pieces of evidence we have for the Viking Age, and it spares no one. For now, you should hold this in your mind. The silver in Astrid's scale is not innocent. The wealth of the Viking world, however much it was also built on Sigurd's Loom and Thorfinn's stockfish and Ulf's barley, was also built on the iron collar at the throat of the woman drawing water from the well at the end of this alley. Any honest history has to look at both, and we will. But Hedeby is not only its dark trades. Walk a little further down the street, past Astrid's workshop, past the small lane that leads to the slave pens, and you arrive at the long row of artisan workshops that, in their quieter way, are also at the heart of what this town is. There is a soapstone carver here who supplies cooking pots to half the farms of southern Jutland. There is an antler comb maker, a profession that does not sound impressive to a modern ear, but that was, in its day, a perfectly respectable craft whose combs, fine-toothed and double-sided, have been found by archaeologists from York to Kiev. There is a glass bead worker whose tiny beads of jewel-colored glass emerald, sapphire, ruby, sometimes streaked or trailed in patterns, will end up around the necks of women on farmsteads in Norway, Sweden, Iceland, and eventually Greenland. This is the part of Hedeby that astonishes archaeologists. The town has been dug up, in parts, since the 1800s, and the inventory of objects that have come out of its waterlogged soil reads like a catalogue of the medieval world. Glass from the Rhineland, pottery from the Frankish heartland, quernstones from the basalt quarries of Mayen, hundreds of miles up the Rhine, silk from somewhere along the Silk Road, fine enough that the strands cannot be replicated by any northern weaver, walrus ivory from the white expanses of the Arctic, brought south by Norwegian traders, slate whetstones from quarries in central Norway, reindeer antler combs from the far north, spices that have crossed the Mediterranean and come up through Italy and Francia by ox cart, and of course, those small hammered Arabic dirhams by the thousand. Astrid, after sorting the morning's amber, picks up a finished piece from the leather-lined box at her elbow. It is a small carved bear, no bigger than the joint of her thumb, hung on a fine twisted silver wire. The carving is the work of the man across the street. The silver is the work of a jeweler 2 doors down. The amber is from a beach on the southern Baltic, picked up by a Slavic boy whose name Astrid does not know. The piece will sell, by the end of the week, to a Frisian merchant going home to a wife in the marshes of what is now the northern Netherlands, who will give it to her without quite knowing where any of the 4 people who made it lived. This is what Hedeby is. It is a place where the work of unknown hands flows together into objects and then back out into the world along threads no single person can see all of. Chapter 8. The long reach of the northern trade. To understand how it all works, it helps to step back and look, for a moment, at the shape of the network as a whole. Picture the Norse trade system as it stood in the late 9th century. Picture Hedeby at the bottom of it, sitting at the base of the Jutland Peninsula, at the narrow waist where the North Sea and the Baltic almost meet. From Hedeby, ships move west to Frisia and Francia, south by ox cart and riverboat into the Carolingian heartland, and north into Scandinavia by the 2 main highways of the Norse world, the sea and the inland waterways. Picture, in central Sweden, the trading island of Birka, sitting on a lake that connects through a system of channels to the Baltic. Picture, on the western Oslo Fjord, the harbor at Kaupang, which serves the Norwegian trade. Picture, far to the east, the small fortified trading post at Staraya Ladoga, where the rivers of Russia begin their slow descent toward the Caspian Sea. A trader in Hedeby, in this period, does not really need to ever travel further than his own market square to handle goods from any of these places. The system brings the goods to him. Furs, slate, soapstone, walrus, ivory, amber, wool, dried fish, iron, and the carefully bagged sample of every kind of trade good in the northern world flow into Hedeby on the prows of the wide-bellied trading ships the Norse called knarrer. These are not the famous longships. The longships are the warships, the slim, swift vessels of the raiders. The knarrer are the freighters broader, deeper in the hull, slower, less glamorous, and absolutely essential to the entire enterprise. We will come back to them, alongside their faster cousins, when we look at how the Norse actually crossed the open ocean. For now, you should hold a picture in your mind of 2 kinds of ships at the wharves of Hedeby. The long, slim ones, sleeping. and the broad, heavy ones working. Astrid, leaning in her doorway, watches the street. Two boys go past pushing a small handcart loaded with split firewood, arguing about something one of them said about the other one's sister. A Saxon merchant in a heavier southern cloak walks past, with the slightly bewildered expression of a man who has not yet quite worked out the layout of the town. A pair of Norse smiths, blackened to the elbow, head down to the harbor to wash before the midday meal. Astrid lets her gaze rest on each of them for the small fraction of a second that an experienced trader's eye lets it rest, and then moves on. There is nothing in particular that needs her attention this morning. There is also, as there always is, the quiet running calculation in the back of her head about who is in town today, who is leaving in the next few days, who might be carrying news from where she has goods on consignment, and what the price of amber in the inland Frankish markets was likely to have done in the last 6 weeks based on the small fragments of news she has picked up. The young woman polishing amber on the low bench behind her is Astrid's apprentice. Her name is Helga. She is the daughter of a cousin of Astrid's late husband, sent down from a farm in southern Norway 2 years ago at the age of 16, with the understanding that, if she did well, Astrid would teach her the trade and, in time, when Astrid eventually retired or died, would consider whether the business should pass to her. This is not a charity arrangement. Astrid expects, and is getting, hard, steady work in exchange. Helga had spent the first 6 months in Hedeby being quietly miserable in a town that smelled of things her farm had not prepared her for, and the next year and a half developing into one of the more careful and methodical young workers Astrid has ever supervised. The amber pieces coming out of her hands at the end of the day, polished, sorted, and ready for sale, are now indistinguishable from the work of a master twice her age. Helga does not know this. Astrid does. Astrid has not told her, partly because Astrid does not believe in overpraising the young, and partly because she has not yet quite finished deciding what she thinks about Helga's chances in the harder, more invisible parts of the trade. The parts that do not happen at the bench, but at the doorway. In the careful 1-second assessment of a stranger's clothing, the half-second decision about which of 2 stories a merchant has just told her she is going to act on. What Astrid is also thinking this morning, though even she would not articulate it to herself in quite these words, is that this trade, this town, this entire careful, elaborate network of silver and amber and stockfish and walrus ivory is sitting on something that may not last. There is a king in Denmark now, a man named Horik II, who has been steadily extending his authority over Hedeby and its hinterland in ways that 20 years ago would not have been possible. There is a young earl in western Norway, a man called Haraldur Fairhair, who, in the last several years, has begun an aggressive program of unifying the small kingdoms of his coast under a single crown, a program that, by all accounts coming up the inlet, is going badly for anyone who disagrees with him. The Norse world that Astrid grew up inside a world of independent farms and small bygdir and assemblies in forest clearings and free traders moving between them is, very slowly, very politely, beginning to give way to a different kind of world. A world of kings. The great curving earthen rampart that surrounds Hedeby on its landward side is, in some respects, the most visible symbol of this slow change. The rampart was not built by Astrid's grandfather's generation. It is being built extended, reinforced, raised higher in Astrid's own lifetime. It is being built because the world is becoming a more dangerous place for towns full of valuable goods. It is being built because there are more kings now, and more armies, and more reasons for armies to want what Hedeby has. The rampart will hold, more or less, for the next 2 centuries. And then, in the year 1066, the same year, by one of history's quieter coincidences that the Norse king Harald Hardrada will fall to an English arrow at Stamford Bridge, ending what most historians consider the last great Viking expedition. Hedeby itself will be destroyed by fire and never rebuilt, but that, mercifully, is 200 years away from Astrid's mourning, and she has work to get back to. She turns back from the doorway. She picks up the small piece of birch bark on which she keeps her running daily accounts and a bone stylus, and begins, with the careful attention of a woman who has been doing this for 2 decades, to record the morning's small transactions. She does not use writing in the way we mean writing. There is a writing system in the Norse world, the runic alphabet, the Futhart, named after its first 6 letters. But it is not used for accounting in any sustained way. It is used, mostly, for short inscriptions on objects, for memorial stones, for the small magical or commemorative phrases that belong on the hilt of a sword or the side of a comb. Astrid's accounting is done in tally marks. So many strokes for so many beads sold, so many for so many pendants. A short list of customer names indicated by abbreviated symbols that mean something specific to her, and almost nothing to anyone else. She is, in her own private way, perfectly literate in the system she has invented for her own business. She is also, like the overwhelming majority of people in her world, including most of the men in it, illiterate in the broader sense. The Norse world in 870 is overwhelmingly an oral world. Its laws are remembered, its poetry is composed and recited, its history is told by firelight, in the long winter evenings, by people whose memories have been trained from childhood to hold extraordinary amounts of material in extraordinary detail. We will come back to that oral world, to the sagas, to the skaldic poetry, to the long firelit evenings when the household gathers and listens much later in our story, when winter closes in on Thorfinn's longhouse and the work of the day shifts from the field to the hearth. For now, we leave Astrid quietly tallying her morning's accounts in her workshop in Hedeby, with her apprentice polishing amber on the bench behind her, and the small gray and cream cat asleep between them on a wooden stool, and the smoke of 1,000 other hearths rising over the rooftops outside. And we lift our gaze for the last time this morning, off the rooftops of Hedeby and out toward the open Baltic that begins at the mouth of the inlet, because there is, on the eastern horizon of that water, a place we have not yet visited in detail tonight, and that, if we are going to understand how the silver flowed, and how the slaves moved, and how the Norse world built its trade network into the largest of its era, we are going to have to visit very soon. Out there, 300 miles east of where Astrid is sitting, lies an island in the cold middle of the Baltic. An island whose farmers, by some quiet accident of geography, have ended up sitting astride the single richest current of silver in the medieval north. That island is called Gotland, and we began our story with the man with the 2 oak chests and the 14,000 coins and the stone wall, and the morning he buried it all and walked away, lives there. Exactly 100 years from this morning, in a future neither he nor Astrid nor Thorfinn, nor anyone alive in 870 can quite see clearly yet. We are not, however, going to wait 100 years to get there, because in Astrid's world in this very year, the silver pipeline that will one day fill those chests is already running. The riverboats are already on the Volga. The pelts and the captives and the amber and the iron are already moving south. The dirhams are already moving north. And on Gotland itself, in farms not unlike Thorfinn's but better placed by 1,000 miles of cold open water, families are already beginning the long, quiet, generational habit of taking that silver, weighing it on small bronze scales and burying it. They will bury so much of it over the next century and a half that archaeologists working on Gotland today have found more hoards of Viking Age silver on that one small island than in any other comparable region of Europe. Tens of thousands of coins, hundreds of separate hoards, some buried under stone walls, some buried under thresholds, some buried under hearths, some buried by some last calculating householder in the very middle of a barley field, calculating because nobody plants in the middle of a field they have already planted, and nobody, therefore, digs there by accident. Astrid, finishing her morning's tally, holds one of those dirhams up between her thumb and forefinger for a moment longer than is strictly necessary. She does not read Arabic. She cannot tell you which caliph minted this particular coin, in which city, in which year, but she has handled enough of them over 20 years to know the weight of a good one, the color of a freshly minted one, the feel of one that has been clipped or hammered down to cheat its bearer. She has noticed, in the last several years, that the coins coming in from the east are arriving in slightly larger quantities, slightly more regularly, and from slightly newer mints than they used to. Something somewhere far to the east has shifted. The pipeline is widening. She does not know why, and she will not live to see the full consequences of it. But it is, in a quiet way, the single most important economic fact of her professional life. We are going to spend the next great stretch of our evening following that pipeline. We are going to follow it east, out of Hedeby, across the Baltic, and into the long cold rivers of what the Norse called Gardariki. We are going to follow it all the way down to the Caspian Sea. And we are going to find, when we get there, the answer to the question we opened with the question of how the silver got under that wall on Gotland, and why the man who buried it never came back. Chapter 9. East across the Baltic. The long rivers begin. We are going to follow the silver east. To do that, we are going to have to leave Hedeby, to leave Astrid at her workbench, and Helga at her polishing stone, and the small gray and cream cat asleep between them, and step aboard one of the wide-bellied trading ships in the harbor. We will pretend, for the next several hours of this evening, that we are passengers. We are not. The Norse did not really do passengers. Anyone aboard a Knorr in the year 870 was either crew, owner, or cargo. But for the purposes of understanding how the silver got to Gotland and how the slaves got to Baghdad, you can ride along in your mind. We will leave the rampart of Hedeby behind us. We will run east on a steady wind for 3 or 4 days. We will see the long flat coast of what is now Poland to the south of us, and, on a good clear morning, the dim gray smudge of Gotland to the north. And we will keep going. After perhaps 8 or 9 days of running, depending on the wind, the ship rounds a low headland and the eastern Baltic shoreline opens. Pine forest, reedy estuary, a low gravelly shore where, by the small smoke of cooking fires drifting up through the trees, other ships have already arrived. We are now at the mouth of a river, the Norse call the Neva, the same river that, in our own time, runs through the city of St. Petersburg. The town of St. Petersburg, of course, does not yet exist, and will not exist for the better part of 900 years. There is, however, a smaller and far older trading post a little way upriver. Sitting on a wide curve of black water at the head of the lake, the Norse call Ladoga. It is one of the most important places in the entire Viking world, and almost no one in modern conversation has ever heard of it. The Norse call this place Aldeijuborg. In Russian it survives, with the letters slightly shuffled, as Staraya Ladoga, the old Ladoga, a small village in modern Russia that to this day pulls archaeologists out of their winter offices the way the smell of warming honey pulls children out of theirs. It is, on the morning we visit it, perhaps 120 years old. It was founded by Norse settlers somewhere around the middle of the 700s, on land already known to and used by the local Slavic and Finnic peoples, and it has functioned ever since as the single most important gateway between the Norse world to the west and the great river and forest interior of what we would now call European Russia. Every ship that wants to follow the silver to its source has to start here. The first thing you have to understand about Aldagjborg is that when you arrive in your seagoing trading ship, you are going to have to leave it behind. The Baltic Nor, broad-beamed, deep-keeled, built to carry tons of cargo across open water, is exactly the wrong kind of ship for what comes next. What comes next is hundreds of miles of slow black rivers, shallow lakes, sandbars, fallen trees, narrow channels through reed beds, and, at certain truly unforgiving stretches, actual stretches of land where there is no river at all, and your boat has to be dragged overland on wooden rollers between two waterways. The Norse called these dry stretches volok. The word survives in Russian as the verb volochit, to drag. And the small portage routes between the great rivers of Russia were lined with worn, smooth log rollers, scattered with the patient swearing of generations of boatmen, and walked by horses and oxen pulling ropes attached to keels that were never quite designed to be dragged across mud. The river boats that take over from the seagoing ships are smaller, usually 30 to 35 feet long, flatter-bottomed, lighter, easier to drag, and built specifically for this journey. They have a single small square sail that can be set on a stretch of lake or a wide, slow river, but most of the propulsion for most of the route is going to be oars and poles. The Norse and their Slavic colleagues called the men who worked these boats and the men who traveled with them by an interesting name. They were the Rus. We will come back to that word, because it is the name from which the whole of modern Russia eventually takes its identity. The simplest version of the story is this. Somewhere in the 8th or 9th century, the Norse traders moving along these rivers became known among the local Slavic and Finnic peoples by a word, Rus, that may have come from a Finnish term for the rowers, or from an older Norse coastal place name. The word stuck. The river traders and their settlements became Rus. The lands they moved through became the land of the Rus. And many centuries later, long after the Norse element in their identity had dissolved into the Slavic majority, the name was still there. Chapter 10. The Dragon Below the Waterline. How Norse Ships Were Built. We have been talking about Norse ships now for several hours. Trading ships at Hedeby, seagoing ships across the Baltic, riverboats at Aldagjborg, the Longships sleeping at the wharves, the sail Sigrid weaves on her loom. It is probably time we slowed down and looked at what one of these vessels actually was, because if there is one piece of technology that defines the Viking Age, that makes everything we have so far described possible, that turns scattered farming households into a network capable of moving silver from Baghdad to Gotland, it is the ship. And the strange and slightly counterintuitive truth about the Viking ship is that almost everything that made it brilliant happened below the waterline, where almost nobody ever saw it. The hull of a Norse ship is what is called clinker-built. The word clinker is a corruption of an older word, clenched, and it refers to the way the long curved planks, the strakes, overlap each other along their edges, like roof shingles. Each strake is fastened to the one below it by hundreds of small iron rivets. The whole structure is then made watertight by packing the joints with tar and animal hair. This is, on its own, not an especially revolutionary technique. Boats had been built in something like this fashion in northern Europe for centuries before the Vikings. What was revolutionary was what the Norse did with it. The strakes of a Norse ship are absurdly thin. On a longship of the kind that will, by the year 908, become famous in the Western chronicles as a terror of the coasts, the planks are sometimes barely an inch thick. They are shaved down by hand using axes and draw knives until the wood is light enough that a moderately strong man can lift one strake unaided. The whole hull is, in effect, more like a wickerwork basket of carefully bent oak than like a heavy timber container. It flexes, it twists, it moves with the water in a way that, to an observer used to the heavy ships of the southern Mediterranean, would have looked alarmingly flimsy. And that is exactly the point, because a hull that flexes does not break. A modern naval architect, looking at the lines of a Norse ship for the first time, will notice this immediately. The boat is not designed to resist the sea. It is designed to move with the sea. When a swell lifts the bow, the ship flexes. When a trough drops the stern, the ship flexes. The whole long hull, 20 or 30 or, in some cases, 60 feet of it, is alive in a way that a rigid hull simply is not. This means that the boat can be lighter. The boat can be shallower. The boat can be driven harder in worse weather with a smaller crew than any comparable vessel of its period. It also means that the boat can do something that almost no other warship in the world can do. It can come up a river. This is the second great trick of the Norse hull. The longship has almost no draft. A loaded warship of 30 oars sits in perhaps 2 feet of water. Compare that to the great galleys of the Mediterranean, which sat in 5 or 6. Compare it to the cargo ships of the Frankish coast, which sat in 8. The Norse longship, sitting in 2 feet of water, could go places no other warship of its period could go. It could come up the Seine to Paris. It could come up the Thames to London. It could come up the Loire all the way into the heart of Francia. It could come up the Volkhov to Aldeigjuborg, and then up the Lovat, across the long Volok portage, and down into the Dnieper. There were almost no rivers in the European world that a Norse longship could not, given enough men on the oars and enough patience, work its way up. This single fact, this absurd, accidental, almost incidental fact about how much water a Norse hull required, reshaped the political map of Europe for almost 3 centuries. There is one more piece of the puzzle to set in place. The Norse ship is not built from a plan. It is not built from drawings. There were no drawings, almost certainly. In the year 870, there was nothing that we would recognize as a blueprint in the entire Norse world. A Norse shipwright knew how to build a ship the way an experienced cook knows how to make a particular soup. By eye, by feel, by memory. By a long, slow, hand-on training that began in adolescence and never really ended. The senior shipwright in the yard we are watching learned his craft from his father, who learned it from his father, who almost certainly learned it from his. There may be some debate among modern scholars about whether the Norse used any kind of standardized measuring rod, and the archaeological evidence suggests they probably did, since the proportions of finished ships are remarkably consistent. But the design itself lived in the eye and the hands of the master, and was transmitted by demonstration and correction. If you asked the master shipwright what made one of his ships better than another, he would not have given you a theoretical answer. He would have shrugged and said something like, "This one will run well." He could not have told you why. He had spent 40 years of his life learning to recognize when a hull was about to run well and when it was not, and the knowledge had become so deep that it was no longer something he could explain. It was something he was. Those of you who served in the trades, who learned a craft from an older man, who could feel, by the small adjustments of a tool in his hand, what no manual could ever quite describe, will recognize this kind of knowledge exactly. It is the knowledge that built the Viking ships, the same way it built the wooden barns of New England, the cabinetry of the Black Forest, and the rifles of the Pennsylvania frontier. And it does not, as any of you who lived through the transition from craftwork to industrial work in the 20th century already know, write itself down very well. We will not, in this account, get into every detail of how a Norse ship was rigged, how its single great square sail was reefed in heavy weather, or how the steering oar, a broad blade, hung on the right side of the stern. The starboard side a word that comes directly from the Old Norse styrboard. The steering side was used to control a hull that had no rudder in the modern sense. But you should hold these images in your mind, because the next time someone shows you a photograph of a reconstructed Norse longship and says, "Look at the dragon prow, look at the painted shields along the side, look at the brightly colored sail," you should remember that the dragon and the shields and the colors were what the Norse wanted you to see. What kept them alive and what built their world was the part below the water, the shaved thin strakes, the single great keel, the flexing hull, and the master shipwright with the leather apron and the weathered hands, who could not have told you, in words, how he knew. Chapter 11. Down the long rivers, from Lake Ladoga to the Caspian. Now we are back on the river. The flotilla of 3 small flat-bottomed boats, our own and 2 others traveling in company, is moving down the Volkhov toward the great inland lake of Ilmen. The pace is slow. The pace is supposed to be slow. You are not on this kind of journey in a hurry. You are in a long, careful caravan, and the rhythm of it is set by the slowest oar on the slowest boat, by the depth of the river under your keel, and by the patience of the men and women who have done this before. You will be on these rivers in this kind of boat for 2 months. You will eat in the boat. You will sleep on the bank. You will wake stiff. You will eat again. You will row. You will reach a place where the river runs out, and you will get out. And you will drag the boat overland, and you will put it back in another river, and you will row again. And after 8 or 9 weeks of this, you will arrive somewhere that, to a Norwegian farmer's son, looks less like a place than like a dream that someone has decided to make true. The portages are where the journey becomes hard. There are 2 great ones on the route to the south. The first is the carry between the Lovet River and the western Dvina, or on a different route between the Lovet and the Dnieper. The second is the carry between the upper Volga system and the lower Don. Each of these crossings is, in practical terms, a long muddy track through forest country maintained by local Slavic communities who charge a quiet, steady fee for the right to use it. The Norse have learned not to argue about the fees. The Norse have also learned, after some hard early lessons, not to try these portages without local guides. The forest of central Russia in the year 870 is enormous and is not entirely empty. The people who live in it speak languages most of the Norse traders do not understand, follow customs the Norse find strange, and have a very long and not entirely friendly memory for traders who behave badly. The Norse, on the whole, behave well. Their willingness to behave well is, as much as anything else, what keeps the river network running. At night, on the portage, the company camps. There is, by the firelight, a long, careful exchange of information between the Norse traders and their local guides, where the next stretch of river is shallow, where a Khazar customs station has been moved, where, last spring, a feud between 2 clans of Slavic forest dwellers spilled across a section of the road, and the road is, for the time being, best avoided by going slightly to the east. The Norse traders take all of this in. They pay for the information. They pay, also, for the meat and bread that the local women bring out from a small settlement on a clearing not far away. There is a quiet, careful economy at every step of this route, and most of the people running it are not, in fact, Norse. They are the local Slavic and Finnic communities along whose rivers and through whose forests the trade passes. The Norse are the long-distance carriers. The locals are the highway. After 2 months of this, after the lakes and the portages, and the slow black rivers and the long stretches, where, for days at a time, nothing changes except the angle of the sun, the river suddenly widens. The trees on the banks pull back. The water turns a different color. And you are on the Volga. The Volga is not like any river the Norse have so far been on. It is half a mile wide in places. It runs for thousands of miles. It is the highway down which the silver of the Caliphate comes north, and the furs and slaves of the north go south. And along its banks, every 2 or 3 days, sits a small fortified outpost where merchants Slavic, Finnic, Norse, Khazar, Bulgar are buying and selling under the careful taxation of whatever local authority happens to be in charge of that particular bend of the river. The Norse traders pay their tolls. They are watched carefully by the men whose job it is to watch them. They keep their hands away from their weapons. They keep their voices low. They sell here and there a small lot of furs, a small lot of amber, a few of the captives they have brought with them. They buy here and there the small leather pouches of silver that have come up the river the other way. The Khazar Khaganate is the great power of this stretch of the river. We do not have time tonight to do justice to the Khazars, but they deserve a moment of acknowledgement because they are one of the more genuinely surprising states of the medieval world, and almost no one in the modern English-speaking conversation has heard of them. They are a steppe nomadic people who, by the year 870, have built a sophisticated multi-religious commercial empire on the lower Volga. Their ruling class, by tradition, has converted to Judaism, one of the few major non-Mediterranean medieval polities to do so, while their population includes Muslims, Christians, and adherents of older steppe religions in roughly equal proportions. They run a careful and remarkably tolerant administration. They tax the river trade. They take a percentage of every cargo that passes through their territory. And they have a working relationship with the Norse traders that, for several generations now, has been quietly, profitably, mutually advantageous to all involved. South of the Khazar capital, a city called Itil, sitting near the mouth of the Volga, of which essentially nothing remains today, and whose exact location is still disputed by archaeologists, the river opens into a great inland sea. The Norse, who have grown up on the cold gray Atlantic and the cold gray Baltic, are now, for the first time in their lives, on warm water. The Caspian Sea, at the southern terminus of the Volga, is salt, though not as salt as the open ocean, and is bordered on its southern shores by the cities of the Islamic Caliphate. To Norse eyes, the Caspian is a deeply strange place. The light is wrong. The color of the water is wrong. The temperature, in late summer, is the kind of heat that a Norwegian farmer's son has heard about in the tales of distant places, but has not, until this moment, ever actually walked through. The air smells of dust, salt, and something faintly resinous that one of the older traders eventually identifies as the mastic gum used in the caulking of the local boats. The southern shore of the Caspian is, in the year 870, part of the easternmost provinces of the Abbasid Caliphate, the great Islamic empire whose capital sits at Baghdad, 2,000 miles further south on the Tigris. The Norse traders who have made it this far, and not all do. The journey is long, expensive, dangerous, and most Norse trading is done at much shorter range, are now standing at the very edge of a civilization that, in 870, is in many respects the most sophisticated on Earth. Baghdad in this period is a city of perhaps 500,000 people, possibly more. It has a bureau of translation that has, over the previous several decades, systematically translated almost every surviving Greek philosophical, mathematical, and medical text into Arabic. It has libraries, it has astronomical observatories, it has hospitals, public bathhouses, paved streets, and a postal system that runs to the Indus and the Pyrenees. The silver coins that have been moving north through the river system for the last 100 years are minted in this city and in cities like it, and the people who hand them to the Norse traders in the markets of the southern Caspian have themselves never been more than a few hundred miles from where they were born. This is where the trade is consummated, in small courtyards like this one, across low tables on patterned rugs, with the small, careful click of bronze weights against bronze pans, and the small, quiet conversation of two men who do not share a language but who share, between them, a third, the language of weights, of grades of silver, of the small, almost wordless commercial sign language that long-distance traders have always used to do business across the boundaries of speech. The Norse trader has brought furs, sable and marten and ermine and beaver, the cold, thick winter pelts of the northern forests, which in the courts and palaces of the southern world will be turned into the linings of robes worn by men whose names the Norse trader will never know. The Norse trader has brought walrus ivory. He has brought amber. He has, by the time he reaches this courtyard, almost always also brought human beings, Slavic, Frankish, Irish, Anglo-Saxon, sometimes Baltic Finn, whose passage south through the Khazar customs posts and down the Volga and across the Caspian has been the single most lucrative and the single most morally costly element of his cargo. The Persian merchant pays in silver. The transaction takes perhaps 2 hours, including the formal serving of cool water, the slow, careful weighing of each pouch of coins, the polite small refusals and renewed offers that, in this part of the world, are the normal courtesies of commerce. And so, finally, after 8,000 words of preparation, we are looking at the moment we have been moving toward all night. This small, careful passage of a leather pouch from a southern hand to a northern hand in a courtyard on the southern shore of the Caspian Sea is where the silver enters the long pipe that will eventually carry it north. It is where the dirhams begin their journey home. They will travel back up the Caspian, up the Volga, through the Khazar customs posts, paying a percentage at each one, across the portages, down the Volkhov, out into the Baltic, and west into the markets of Hedeby and Birka and Kaupang, where Astrid and women like her will weigh them on small bronze scales and use them to buy amber, cloth, glass, and one another's labor. And from there, some fraction of them will go further still. They will be carried in pouches by farmers like Thorfinn going to summer assemblies. They will be paid as bride prices. They will be paid as were gild the carefully calculated compensation that one family pays another for the death of a son. And some of them, eventually, will end up on a small island in the cold middle of the Baltic in the year 970 in 2 oak chests under a flat slab of limestone in a wall at the edge of a quiet barley field where their owner will lay them down and walk away into the snow and never come back. Chapter 12. The Wall on Gotland. An answer at last. This is the answer we promised you at the start. And this is the part of the answer that is also, in its way, an admission of how history actually works. This is most of the answer. Who exactly the man on Gotland was, we will never know. His name is not written on any of the coins. His face is not on any of the surviving carved stones of the island. He is, for us, a shadow at the edge of a wall, carrying 2 chests in a pre-dawn winter in the year 970. But what we do know, what the careful work of 2 centuries of archaeologists and economic historians has slowly assembled, hoard by hoard and dirham by dirham, is the system that put the silver into his hands. The silver in his chests was paid for in furs that were trapped in the boreal forests of northern Scandinavia and Russia. It was paid for in walrus ivory cut from the white expanses of the Arctic. It was paid for in amber gathered on the beaches of the southern Baltic. It was paid for in the bodies of men, women, and children carried unwillingly south down the Volga to courtyards, like the one we just stood in. It was minted in the cities of Iraq and Persia and Central Asia. It traveled north along the rivers we just rode. It passed through the hands of Khazar officials, Slavic and Finnic guides, Persian merchants, Norse traders, Frisian middlemen, and dozens of others whose names history has forgotten. And it ended for one specific man on one specific morning on one specific island in the cold middle of the Baltic, in 2 oak chests under a stone wall. Why he never came back is a question we cannot answer. Possibilities crowd in on the historical imagination, all of them plausible, none of them provable. Perhaps he was on his way to fight in one of the small wars that, in the late 10th century, were beginning to consume Gotlandic and Scandinavian society as the old free farms gave way to the new royal kingdoms. Perhaps he was on his way to a market and was robbed or killed on the road. Perhaps he traveled abroad east on the rivers we just traveled, or west across the Baltic, and died in some quiet way that left no record. Perhaps he fell ill on the way home. Perhaps the family farm passed to a son who never knew where the chests were buried, and who searched, in his grief, in every place but the right one. Perhaps the wall stood for 1,000 years as a small private grave marker over a small private fortune that nobody alive understood had ever existed. What we do know is what the archaeologists found when, in the summer of 1999, a Gotlandic farmer running a metal detector across his own quiet stretch of field heard the high, steady tone that, to anyone who has spent any time with one of those machines, means something serious. The local antiquities authorities were called. Excavation began. Over the course of the following weeks, the 2 oak chests were carefully exposed, lifted, and brought back to the laboratory. They contained, in total, more than 14,000 silver coins, most of them dirhams, struck across a span of 3 centuries, from mints stretching from Spain to Central Asia, along with hundreds of pieces of cut and weighed silver bullion, broken brooches, twisted arm rings, and several intact silver vessels. It is, by a considerable margin, the largest Viking Age silver hoard ever found. It is called, in the modern scholarly literature, the Spillings Hoard, named for the small farm in northern Gotland where it was uncovered. And every one of those 14,000 coins has, in its small, worn way, a story very much like the one we have just spent the last several hours telling. And in our story, because our story is not, in the end, the story of the man on Gotland, but the story of the world that put the silver in his chests, we now go back, one last time, to a quiet fjord on the western coast of Norway in the year 870. The day on Thorfinn's farm is ending. The barley sheaves in the upper field have been turned and returned. The cow that was lame this morning is sound. The 2 cod that came out of the fjord at midday are gutted, split, and hanging on the high drying racks behind the longhouse. The cloth on Sigrid's loom is half an inch longer than it was at dawn. Hild has set the day's milk going into cheese. Ulf has split tomorrow's firewood, and little Aslog has, over the course of the day, gradually transformed her tangle of raw fleece into a slightly less tangled tangle of raw fleece, which Hild has very seriously praised as the work of a future weaver. The light is going out of the sky over the fjord. The first thin column of smoke is rising from the longhouse's smoke hole. The fire is being built up for the evening meal. And the small, careful thought that Ketil the traveler put down on a high shelf at the back of every adult head on this farm, the thought about an empty island far to the west, and a man called Ingolfur who is fitting out a ship is still there, waiting, getting a little heavier with each passing hour. Chapter 13. A long evening by the fire, bread, bowls, and the old stories. The evening meal in Thorfinn's longhouse is not, by any modern standard, an elaborate affair. There is a soapstone pot of barley stew, thickened with a little of yesterday's leftover porridge and flavored with a small handful of dried herbs from a bunch hanging in the rafters. There is a round, flat loaf of dark rye bread, baked on the hearthstone 3 days ago, and now firm enough to require what Sigrid would call serious chewing. There is a wedge of cheese, yesterday's cheese, not today's being still 6 weeks from edible. There is a small bowl of buttermilk to drink, and a single wooden cup of barley ale that Thorfinn and Sigrid will share between them, and that the children will not touch by long household custom until they are old enough to be sent to a midsummer assembly and bring back its rumors. There is a particular small ritual to the start of a Norse meal that, if you were watching closely, you might catch. Thorfinn breaks the bread first. Not because he is the man of the house, though he is, but because in this longhouse, that is the small piece of dignity that opens the meal. He breaks off a piece for himself, and a piece for Sigrid, and then the loaf is passed. Halldór helps Eyvind tear a piece off, because Eyvind, at 7, has a strong tendency to take too much, and a stronger tendency to look slightly aggrieved when corrected. Aslaug, sitting on her mother's lap, is given a small, soft middle piece that has been steamed over the pot to make it easier for her small teeth. Ulf and Hild are passed the loaf last, and take small pieces, and say "Take thanks" in the small, undecorated way that has become normal in this household over many years. None of this is loud. None of it is announced. It is simply the shape of the meal. The way a long-married couple's small physical habits are simply the shape of their marriage. The stew is, by long Norse standard, very good. The barley has been cooking slowly all afternoon. There are small pieces of last spring's mutton in it. Not many, because the family is rationing carefully against the winter, but enough that every spoonful has a little something to chew on. There are bits of root vegetable turnip, mostly, and a little of the small bitter wild carrot that grows in the meadow above the byre. There is salt, used carefully, because salt is expensive, and the year's supply has to last. There is no pepper. Pepper, in 870, is a luxury that exists in Hedeby and Birka, and possibly in the wealthier coastal estates of southern Norway, but it has not, in any meaningful quantity, reached Thorfinn's Fjord, and even if it had, he would not be using it on a Tuesday. He would be saving it for the midwinter feast, and possibly for the visit of his sister's husband from up the coast, who has, in Thorfinn's quiet professional opinion, slightly overlarge ideas of his own importance, and would be impressed by the presence of pepper on the table. Aslaug, on her mother's lap, has spent the last several minutes engaged in the deeply serious 4-year-old's work of trying to drink buttermilk from a wooden cup that is, by any objective measure, too big for her. She is not asking for help. She is not going to ask for help. She is going to manage this on her own, even if it takes longer than the entire rest of the meal. Sigrid, who has watched 10,000 small acts of stubborn 4-year-old competence over the course of her 3 children, is letting her. There is, in a Norse household, a strong respect for a child's right to fail at something at her own pace. Aslaug eventually succeeds in drinking exactly half of the buttermilk and spilling exactly the other half down the front of her shift, which Sigrid will deal with in the morning, and which Aslaug will, by then, have entirely forgotten about. When the meal is done, and Norse meals do not have an announced ending, they simply slow and then stop. The bowls are gathered up by Hild and by the older boy, who carries them out to the bucket of cold water at the threshold to be rinsed. The table is pushed back against the wall. The sheepskins come out. The mending baskets come out. The carved bone gaming pieces come out for the boys. The small hand spindle comes off its peg for Sigrid. The piece of leather and the awl that Thorfinn has been meaning to deal with for 2 weeks comes down from a shelf, and the longhouse, for the next 2 or 3 hours before sleep, settles into the long, quiet, hand-busy rhythm that is, in this part of the world and this century, the closest thing the world has to entertainment. It is here, in these long, hand-busy evenings, that the most important cultural work of the Viking world gets done. We have already talked briefly about how the Norse were an oral people, about how their laws were memorized, their poetry was composed and recited, and their history was told by firelight in the long winter evenings. This is one of those evenings. Not a special one, not a feast, just a normal Tuesday evening in late autumn. But the work that is about to happen in this small smoky hall in the next 2 hours between the end of the meal and the banking of the fire for the night is the same work that, over the centuries, will preserve the entire memory of the Norse world. The poems that we now read in modern editions of the Poetic Edda, the sagas of the Icelanders, the genealogies that connect the families of late 10th century Iceland to the western fjords of Norway from which their grandfathers emigrated. All of it was carried generation by generation by people sitting on benches in halls exactly like this one, working leather and wool with their hands, while someone, sometimes a grandmother, sometimes a grandfather, sometimes a wandering poet, sometimes simply whichever of the adults knew the story best spoke. Tonight, after about 20 minutes of working in silence, Thorfinn looks up from his strap of leather and says, and the boys, by old long household instinct, immediately stop their game and look up. Did I ever tell you about the first time my father saw a whale? They have, of course, heard this story. They have heard it perhaps 14 times. But the question is, in a Norse longhouse, a piece of pure ritual? The boys say no, even though they could recite the story themselves. Sigrid, who has heard the story more than 14 times and from a less distant position, smiles to herself over her spindle and does not look up. Ulf and Hild, who have also heard it, settle slightly more comfortably into their work. Aslaug, on Sigrid's lap, is asleep. Outside the longhouse, the wind has begun to lift and is moving the drying racks gently on their wooden tripods. Thorfinn tells the story slowly, the way his father told it to him. His father had been 23 years old. He had been out in a small fishing boat with his own father, Thorfinn's grandfather, a man named Halldor Eyvindarsson, after whom Thorfinn's own elder son is named, at the very mouth of the fjord, at dawn, in late spring. The sea was glass, the dawn was silver, and out of the silver, perhaps 200 yards off the bow, had risen the long, slow, dark back of an animal so large that, for several seconds, Thorfinn's father had been unable to understand what he was looking at. The animal had been longer than the boat, by perhaps 3 times. The animal had been wider in the back than the boat was long. The animal had blown a single soft column of mist into the cold air and then had slid slowly, back beneath the surface, leaving nothing behind but a great smooth circle of water that took a full minute to fade. The boys, who have heard this story since they were very young, lean forward anyway, because the story is not really about a whale. The story is about Thorfinn's father and Thorfinn's grandfather, and the small particular fact that for 30 seconds, on a silver dawn in the fjord, 2 men sat in a boat together and looked at a thing so large that they could not, between them, find words for it. The story is about how when Thorfinn's father had finally turned to look at his own father, the old man had been crying quietly, without saying anything, with no apparent shame and no obvious cause. Thorfinn's father had been 23. He had not understood. Decades later, when he was an old man himself, he had told Thorfinn, and Thorfinn now tells the boys that he had understood, eventually. The grandfather, for those 30 seconds, had been looking at something that was so much larger and so much older than him that the only honest response his body could find was to weep. Because, Thorfinn says now, in the way the boys know to wait for, the world is bigger than we are. And sometimes, if you are very still and the morning is right, it will let you see how much bigger. There is a small silence after Thorfinn finishes. The boys do not say anything. Thorfinn returns very calmly to his leather strap. Sigrid does not look up from her spindle, but the corner of her mouth has moved very slightly in the small private way that, in 15 years of marriage, Thorfinn has come to recognize as her version of saying that was well told. The wind outside has lifted again. Somewhere in the byre, one of the cows shifts her weight. The fire pops softly. Halldor, after a little while, picks up his bone gaming piece again, but he is not really thinking about the game. He is thinking, though he could not articulate it, and would not try, about a silver dawn, and a man crying in a boat, and the way his father's voice had gone slightly lower at the end of the story. He is thinking about whales. He is thinking in a way that has begun to happen to him more often this autumn than he would like to admit, about the gap at the mouth of the fjord and what lies beyond it. Chapter 14. The Gods on the Beam. How the Norse saw their world. If you were to look up, in the long, quiet pause after Thorfinn's story, into the high, dark rafters of the longhouse, you would notice, perhaps for the first time, a small carved wooden figure tucked into a niche in the highest beam. It is no bigger than a man's hand. It is so soot-darkened that, to a stranger's eye, you might miss it entirely. It has been in that niche for longer than Thorfinn has been alive. His father put it there. The figure is seated. Across its small carved lap is the unmistakable shape of a hammer. Beside it, replaced every spring and now beginning to brown, is a small dried sprig of juniper. If you looked at Sigrid's throat as she spun, you would also see, at the open collar of her madder red dress, a small silver pendant on a twisted wool cord. The pendant is in the shape of a hammer. It is, in many respects, the single most famous object of the Viking Age. Archaeologists have found them by the thousand from Ireland to Russia. They are usually small an inch and a half, 2 inches at the most. And they are almost always worn on a cord at the throat. They are the hammer of Thor. They are, in their own quiet way, the religious identity of the Norse household. And it is here, in front of the small carved figure in the rafters and the small silver hammer at Sigrid's throat, that we have to spend some careful minutes talking about how the Norse actually saw their world, because the version that comes down to us through modern films and fantasy novels is, in many of its most popular features, a long way off the truth. The Norse, in 870, are pagans, by which we mean that they have not yet converted to the Christianity that is, by this date, already established along the southern fringes of Scandinavia and is being preached, with varying success, by missionaries from Francia and the British Isles. They will. Within 150 years, almost the entire Norse world will be Christian. But on this Tuesday evening in 870, Thorfinn and his family are still in the easy, unself-conscious way of people who have never imagined being anything else, believers in the old gods. We will be careful here. The Norse religion was not a single rigid doctrine. It was not codified in a holy book. It was not taught by a priestly class. It was a loose, regionally varied, deeply oral tradition that lived in stories, in seasonal festivals, in the small daily gestures we have already seen, the touch on the small wooden disc at the spring this morning, the carved figure in the rafter, the hammer at Sigrid's throat, and in the great public ceremonies that, 3 or 4 times a year, the BGD gathered to perform. If you asked Thorfinn on this Tuesday evening to explain his religion, he would look at you slightly puzzled. The word religion, in the sense we now use it, would not really translate into his Norse. What he would talk about, if you pressed him gently, is the gods. Æsir and Vanir, two families of gods, related but distinct. Odin, the high god, the wanderer, the seeker of knowledge, the lord of poetry and war, and the strange shadowed border between life and death. Though we should be careful, because the modern picture of Odin as the unambiguous king of the gods is partly the work of much later medieval Christian scholars, trying to fit Norse paganism into a familiar Mediterranean shape. Thor, the red-bearded protector of farms and travelers, hammer in hand, the god whose name shows up at Sigrid's throat, and on 100 place names from Iceland to Russia, and whose hammer is, by long agreement, the household guardian of practically every farm in Scandinavia. Freya and Freyr, brother and sister, the gods of fertility, of the harvest, of love and of plenty. Tyr, the one-handed god of law and oaths. Heimdallr, the watchman at the edge of the world. And this is the part of the picture that the heroic version usually leaves out. A vast crowd of smaller, local, half-forgotten powers. The Landvættir, the land spirits that Thorfinn greeted this morning at the spring. The Alfar, the elves, who in 870 were not the tall, radiant beings of much later medieval romance, but small, hidden, neighbor-like powers of the wild places. The Dvergar, the dwarves, who lived in the stones and the mountains, and who, by long tradition, had made most of the great weapons and treasures of the gods. The Disir female spirits, ancestral and protective, to whom particular households owed particular debts. The world Thorfinn lives in is, in a word, crowded. The most visible sign of this crowded world in Thorfinn's longhouse is something you might not have noticed at first glance. On a low stone ledge near the door, set quietly out of the main traffic of the room, there is a small wooden bowl. In the bowl, every evening, Sigrid pours a thin offering of milk and lays a small heel of bread. The offering is for the Husvættir, the spirits of the house, and for whichever of the small invisible neighbors of the farm happen to come by. It will be gone by morning. Sigrid would not, if you asked her, claim to know who exactly takes it. She would tell you, in her dry, steady voice, that something does. She would tell you that her mother put out the same bowl every night, on the same ledge, in the longhouse on the farm where she grew up. She would tell you that, on a farm in the year 870, in a fjord whose nearest paved road is 1,000 miles to the south, you do not particularly want to find out what happens if you stop. It is, she would say, less a matter of faith and more a matter of basic neighborliness. The boys, by the hearth, have resumed their game. The game is called Hnefatafl, a board game whose name simply means fist table. And it is, in a small way, one of the more interesting cultural objects of the Viking Age. The board is a grid scratched onto a flat piece of wood. The pieces are bone, stone, or in the case of richer households, carved walrus ivory. The rules are simple to describe and surprisingly hard to play well. There is a king in the center of the board, surrounded by his defenders. The defenders are outnumbered 2-1 by attackers spread around the edge. The king's side wins if he reaches a corner. The attackers win if they surround him. There is no equivalent in any modern game chess comes closest, but the asymmetry is sharper, and the strategic logic is, in some respects, more interesting. Hnefatafl boards have been found from Ireland to the Caspian, in graves, in longhouses, on board ships. Halldor, in 2 more years, will start to beat his father at it. Eyvind will take considerably longer. Hild, at her mending, is the quietest figure in the room. She has been quiet for 18 years. She came into this longhouse at the age of 13, sold by a Norwegian slave trader to Thorfinn's father, in a transaction Thorfinn himself was not present for, and that, frankly, embarrasses him slightly to recall. She remembers, though she does not often speak of it, a small village by the sea. a mother who sang while she worked, a younger brother whose name she sometimes thinks she remembers, and sometimes thinks she has only invented. She speaks Norse without an accent. She prays, when she prays at all, in a complicated private mixture of Norse gods and a small fading set of words from a language she half remembers her mother using. She has, somewhere on the western edge of the British Isles, a family she will never see again. And she has, in this longhouse, a kind of family she did not ask for. She loves Aslaug as much as Sigrid does. She does not love Thorfinn, though she does not hate him. She and Ulf are not married. Thralls in 870 could not formally marry, though many lived together as effective couples with the household's knowledge and quiet acceptance. But they have shared a low platform at the back of the longhouse for the last 6 years, and they have one son who died of a fever at the age of 2, and they have not had another. It is important, and I want to be careful with this, that we not flatten Hild into a single symbol of suffering, the way some popular accounts of the Viking Age either do or, perhaps worse, try not to do by leaving the slaves out of the story altogether. Hild is not a symbol. She is a person. She is a 31-year-old woman with strong hands and a careful mind and a quiet sense of humor that, on the right evenings, has been known to cut Thorfinn's jokes down to about half their original size. She is treated, in the daily texture of this household, with something close to courtesy. She eats the same porridge from the same bowl as Sigrid does. She sleeps under the same kind of wool blanket. She is not, in the daily way of things, abused, beaten, or forced to do anything Sigrid is not also doing, and she is also not free. She cannot leave. If she walked out of this longhouse tomorrow and tried to make her way to the coast and across the water to whatever village she half remembers, she would be caught, returned, and depending on Thorfinn's mood and the prevailing custom in this district, punished. She is a member of the household, and she is also property. Both things are true at once in the year 870, and the inability to comfortably resolve them is one of the moral facts of her life, and of the world she lives in. If you watched Hild for long enough on this Tuesday evening, you would see her glance for half a second, no longer across the hearth at Aslaug, asleep against Sigrid's shoulder. The look is not a longing one. It is not a resentful one. It is the look of a woman who, 18 years into a life she did not choose, has nevertheless found, in this small smoky hall and in the small soft weight of a 4-year-old, who is in some sense not hers, and in some sense entirely hers, the closest thing her life has been able to give her to peace. She returns to her mending. Aslaug breathes against her mother's shoulder. The lamp burns steadily. The fire pops. Outside, the wind drops. Around what we would call the hour of 9, though there is no clock in the longhouse, and no one in it is thinking in those terms, the household begins, without anything being said, to wind itself down toward sleep. The lamp is trimmed lower. The mending baskets are tucked under the platforms. The gaming pieces are gathered into a small wooden box. Sigrid lifts Aslaug, who does not wake, and lays her on the family platform under a fold of sheepskin. Thorfinn rakes the embers carefully toward the center of the hearth and covers them with a thick blanket of gray ash, the way he banked them this morning, and the way his father banked them and his grandfather banked them before him. The lamp is blown out. The longhouse falls into the soft red darkness of a banked Viking Age hearth, which is one of the more particular kinds of darkness that exist in the world, and which, in 870, in this part of Europe, is the darkness inside which several million people are about to spend the next 8 hours of their lives. Chapter 15. Across the Cold Water. The Settlement of Iceland. We left, in the last chapter, Thorfinn's family settling for sleep on a quiet Tuesday evening in late autumn. We are going to leave them sleeping. because the small, careful thought that Ketil the traveler put down at the back of every adult head in that longhouse, the thought about an empty island and a man called Ingolfur, and a ship being fitted out for spring is, this very season, becoming real on another stretch of the Norwegian coast. Hundreds of miles south of Thorfinn's Fjord, on a long strand in early spring, 3 seagoing ships are being loaded for what is, in the year 870, one of the most genuinely strange and ambitious undertakings of the entire Norse world. Families are going to leave Norway. They are going to leave forever. They are going to cross 600 miles of open Atlantic. And they are going to settle on an island that, by all accounts, is empty. The man we have heard of by name is called Ingolfur Arnarsson. He is a real historical figure, perhaps the most famous of all the founding settlers of Iceland, and his story is preserved, in considerable and sometimes contradictory detail, in a remarkable Icelandic document called the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, written down some 3 centuries after the events themselves, but drawing on an unbroken oral tradition that the Icelanders, in their patient generational way, had refused to let die. According to the Landnámabók, Ingolfur is a young Norwegian nobleman of moderate means and slightly complicated political circumstances. He has been involved, with his foster brother Hjörleifur, in a feud back in Norway that has, by the year 870, made staying at home extremely unwise. He has heard, as Ketil had heard, of an island far to the west. He has decided, and the decision in 870 is not casually made, to take his wife, his thralls, his livestock, and as many other free farmers as want to come, and to go and settle there. The crossing from Norway to Iceland is roughly 600 miles of open Atlantic. It is, for a clinker-built ship of the kind we have been describing, a journey of perhaps 7 to 10 days in favorable weather. Favorable weather is not guaranteed. The North Atlantic, in late spring, is one of the more demanding bodies of water in the world. The ships go. They take with them, and this is one of the more striking facts about the entire enterprise, almost everything they need to start a new life on land that has none of it. Cattle, sheep, goats, chickens, seed grain, hand mills for grinding it, iron tools, looms, though looms are easy enough to remake on the other side. The loom stones are heavy and are mostly left behind. Hand spindles, pots, lamps, soapstone cooking vessels, the carefully wrapped seedlings of a few favored herbs, a small box of carved wooden gods to be set on the other side, in the rafter of the new longhouse, several dozen barrels of salt, the most precious of all consumables, because without salt the cheese cannot be made, and without cheese the new settlement does not, in any meaningful sense, survive its first winter. The Norse, by the year 870, have developed a navigational system for these open water crossings that is, in its quiet way, one of the more impressive intellectual achievements of the early medieval North. They have no compass. The magnetic compass will not arrive in Northern Europe for another 4 centuries. They have no maps in the modern sense. They have no charts, no quadrants, no astrolabes. What they have is a careful empirical knowledge of the sea and the sky, transmitted from generation to generation of working sailors, that includes things we are still, in our own time, only partially reconstructing. They know the latitude of their destination not in degrees, but in the height of the noon sun above the horizon, measured against the length of a man's outstretched arm. They know the appearance of particular cloud banks that, in fair weather, form over land that is itself still below the horizon. They know which species of seabirds fly out from which kinds of coast, and how far out, and at what time of year. They know the color of the water above particular kinds of bottom. They know, on a clear night, the position of certain stars relative to the line of the horizon, and they know how to use that position to keep a course. And they know, and this is the piece of the puzzle, that in our own time, modern researchers are still cautiously investigating possibly how to use certain kinds of polarizing crystal, the so-called solarstein or sunstone, to find the position of the sun on overcast days when its disk is invisible. The evidence for the sunstone is partly textual, partly archaeological, and partly experimental, and you should treat the most confident modern claims about it with the careful skepticism the Norse themselves would have applied to a story you cannot quite verify. But that some kind of overcast day navigation worked, and that the Norse used it to find Iceland reliably, year after year, across hundreds of miles of empty water that is not really in doubt. The story of Ingólfr's actual landfall, the moment the lookout on the lead ship calls land, and the small flotilla turns toward a coast that no one aboard has ever seen with their own eyes, is preserved in the Landnámabók with a small specific detail that gives historians something concrete to hold on to. According to the saga tradition, when Ingólfr sighted the coast, he performed a particular Old Norse act of pious decision-making. He took the two great carved wooden posts of his household, the Öndvegissulur, the high seat pillars, which were the most sacred objects in any Norse longhouse, traditionally set on either side of the hallmaster's seat, and carved with images of the gods, and he threw them overboard. He vowed that wherever the pillars came ashore, he would settle. The pillars drifted somewhere southwest along the coast. Ingólfr's party landed initially at a different place, set up temporary quarters for the first winter, and then sent search parties out to find the pillars. According to the tradition, the pillars were eventually found 3 years later on a curving wide bay on the southwestern coast, and that is where Ingólfr built his permanent farm. The name he gave the place was Reykjavik, Smoky Bay, named for the steam rising off the geothermal springs that came up through the ground in the area. It is, today, the capital of the modern Republic of Iceland and the home of more than a third of that country's population. In 870-something, it was a small turf longhouse on an empty headland surrounded by sheep, and run by a man who had thrown 2 carved poles into the sea and trusted them to find his future for him. Chapter 16. Building a Country from Scratch. Iceland's First Generations. The first thing Ingólfr's settlers do, on the curving headland that will one day be Reykjavik, is build a longhouse. This sounds simple. It is not. There are no trees on this part of Iceland, to speak of the small native birch woods that the first settlers found are confined to certain inland valleys and have, even by the year 900, already begun the long retreat that, by the modern era, will leave Iceland one of the most thinly forested countries in Europe. The timber for the roof has had to be carried on the ship. It is precious. It will be used and reused for generations. What there is, in unlimited quantity, is turf. Long, thick bricks of grass and root and damp, peaty soil, cut with a broad iron blade and stacked on edge to make walls 3 feet thick, 4 feet thick, sometimes 5. By the time the long Icelandic summer ends and the first dark of October closes in, the longhouse is up. The cattle are in a rough turf byre at one end of it, and Ingólfr's 2 great carved high-seat pillars have been set on either side of his place at the hearth. The pillars are the same pillars he threw overboard somewhere south of the coast, pillars that, the saga tradition tells us, his thralls eventually found cast up on a beach, and that gave the new settlement its sacred center. We will come back, before this evening is over, to whether everything the Landnámabók tells us about Ingólfr is literally true. Historians are properly skeptical of saga material set down 3 centuries after the events it describes. But the pattern of the story, the careful, pious decision-making, the deliberate choice of a sacred site, the carrying of the old household's most precious religious objects into a new land. That pattern is real, and it is repeated in dozens of family origin stories preserved in the land Namabok across the next 60 years of settlement. Over the next 60 years, the period the Icelanders themselves came to call the landnam, the land-taking. Somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people make the crossing from Norway, the British Isles, and the Norse settlements in Ireland and the Hebrides, and settle in Iceland. By the year 930, almost every habitable valley on the coast of the island has been claimed and farmed. The settlers bring with them their cattle, their sheep, their language, their gods, their laws, and this is the part that, more than anything else, makes the Icelandic story unique, their absolute determination not to be ruled by a king. Chapter 17. The Þingvellir Assembly. Law without a king. In the year 930, on a flat grass plain on the southwestern part of the island, framed on the north by a great dark basalt cliff that is, in geological fact, the visible meeting of the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates pulling slowly apart from one another. The free farmers of Iceland gather for the first time in what they have decided to call the Alþingi, the All-Thing, the assembly of the whole people. They have come from every settled valley on the island. They have come on horseback, on foot, in small groups by boat along the coast. They have brought tents and provisions for 2 weeks. They have brought disputes to settle, marriages to arrange, news to exchange, and at the center of it all a piece of public business that, in 870, almost no other people in Europe is attempting. They have come to make their own laws. The man standing on the natural rock platform at the foot of the cliff is the Logsögumaður, the law speaker. His job for the next 3 summers will be to recite from memory 1/3 of the laws of the new Commonwealth every year, so that across his 3-year term, every free man and woman in Iceland will have heard, in proper sequence, the full body of the law spoken aloud. There is no written code. There is no king to enforce it. There is, instead, the memory of the law speaker, the assent of the assembled farmers, and the patient willingness of the community to bring its disputes here every June, and to abide by what the assembly decides. This is, in 870 and for the next 300 years, one of the most genuinely radical experiments in self-government anywhere in medieval Europe. It is not, we should be careful to say, a democracy in any modern sense. Thralls have no voice in it. Women have only the indirect voice that the social influence of household management gives them. Power is concentrated in the hands of about 36 regional chieftains called Godar, who command the loyalty of the free farmers in their districts. But within those limits, it is an extraordinary thing. A whole society, on an island in the middle of the North Atlantic, deliberately choosing to do without a crown. The disputes that come before the Alþingi are not, mostly, dramatic. They are the same disputes the Bygd assemblies in Norway have been settling for generations. Who owns this stretch of pasture? Whose son struck whose son at the autumn feast? Whether a particular marriage is valid? Whether a particular killing requires compensation in silver wergild or in the legal recognition of revenge? The Icelanders, over the next 3 centuries, will work all of this out in extraordinary procedural detail. And they will write it down, eventually, in great manuscript codes with names like Gragas the Grey Goose, that survive to our own day, and that constitute one of the most important sources we have for the actual texture of Norse society. They will also produce, in those same 3 centuries, the family sagas, those astonishing prose narratives of feud and farm and love and law, told in the spare, dry, deadpan voice that has influenced every writer of plain prose in the European tradition since. Njal's Saga, Egil's Saga, Laxdæla's Saga, books we still read. Books written down by Christian descendants of the men and women now sitting on this slope below the cliff, who would not have called what they were doing literature, but who were, between them and across the centuries, inventing a tradition that has not since been equaled in Northern Europe. Chapter 18. South to Miklagarðr, the long road to Constantinople. While Ingolfr's grandchildren are clearing the second field on their farm above Reykjavik, and while the men of the Alþingi are sitting on their basalt slope arguing about the boundary between two summer pastures, a third Norse story is unfolding 2,000 miles to the southeast. We have already followed one river route, the long Volga road to the Caspian. There is another, south from the great portage at the headwaters of the Dnieper. The river runs 300 miles, through forest and steppe, past the small fortified Slavic settlements that will eventually become the city of Kiev, and out at last into the warm, pale water of the Black Sea. And on the southern shore of the Black Sea, behind the long double walls that have stood for 500 years already, sits the largest city in the world that the Norse have any way of reaching. The Norse call it Miklagarðr, the great city. We call it Constantinople. Imagine for a moment that you are a young Norseman of perhaps 22 Haldor perhaps, the boy who at 11 was turning barley in his father's upper field and looking at the gap at the mouth of the fjord. He is 22 now. He has come the long way south. He has seen Hedeby. He has seen Aldingjaborg. He has dragged a boat across a portage in the Russian forest at midnight, under a sky full of stars he did not know. He has been frightened twice by Pecheneg horsemen on the lower Dnieper. He has seen the small dirty trading posts of the steppe and the wide open water of the Black Sea. And now, on a hot summer morning, his ship is closing the last few miles toward a wall that runs down to the sea and that, as it grows nearer and nearer, refuses to stop being as enormous as it was when he first saw it from the horizon. He has never seen a stone wall higher than a man's shoulder. He is now looking at one that is 50 feet high, 10 feet thick, and that runs in unbroken curtain from horizon to horizon. Above the wall, he can see the great central dome of a building so vast that he cannot, for the first several minutes, make himself believe it is one building rather than several. It is one building. It is the church of Hagia Sophia, built 4 centuries before he was born, and it is the largest enclosed interior space anywhere on Earth that he could possibly reach. By the time our imagined Haldor arrives at Miklagarðr in the middle of the 10th century, the Byzantine emperors have already discovered something useful about Norse warriors. They are, by long professional habit, willing to fight for whoever pays them. They have no political stake in Constantinople's internal feuds. They speak no Greek. They cannot, therefore, plot in Greek. They are, in their cold, incorruptible way, the perfect imperial bodyguard. By the late 900s, an elite unit of Norse and Anglo-Saxon mercenaries, known as the Varangian Guard, has become the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor, a position of extraordinary prestige and extraordinary pay. Norse runestones from this period, carved on memorial monuments back in Sweden and Norway and Denmark, mention sons and brothers and husbands who went south to Miklagarðr and either came home rich or did not come home at all. A man who survived 10 years of service in the Varangian Guard came back to his Norwegian fjord with enough silver to buy a small kingdom. A man who did not, and the proportion who did not, is hard to estimate, at least left behind a name carved on a stone where his family could see it. These memorial stones, the runestones, are some of the most touching objects of the Viking Age. There are several thousand of them surviving across Scandinavia, most of them from the 10th and 11th centuries. Many of them carry inscriptions in the carefully chiseled runic script, short formal commemorations of the dead carved by stonecutters whose trade was, in this period, becoming a recognized profession in its own right. Ragnvald had this stone raised in memory of his son Holmi, who died in the east among the Greeks. Tola had this stone raised in memory of her son Harold, brother of Ingvar. They journeyed boldly far for gold, and in the east they fed the eagles. They died in the south, in Sörkland. Sörkland, the land of the silk wearers, meant, to a 10th century Swede, somewhere in the Islamic Caliphate. The eagles, in Norse poetry, fed on the bodies of the slain. These stones, scattered across Swedish farm fields, where they were placed as memorials by mothers and widows 1,000 years ago, are some of the most direct human voices we have from the Viking Age. They speak across the centuries in a way that no chronicle and no saga quite can. Those of you who have walked the war cemeteries of France or the Pacific, or stood at memorial stones in your own villages and read the names of the boys who did not come home from Korea or Vietnam, will recognize the impulse exactly. It is the same impulse. It is the same stone. It is the same wind moving through the same grass. Only the alphabet is different. Chapter 19. The Long End. Christ, Kings, and the Closing of the Age. In the year 1000, at the Alþingi of Iceland, a law speaker named Þorgeir Þorkelsson did one of the more remarkable things that any politician anywhere in medieval Europe ever did. The community had reached a point of crisis. About half the population of Iceland had, over the previous generation, converted to Christianity, often under pressure from the increasingly assertive Christian kings of Norway. The other half remained committed to the old gods. The country was on the verge of splitting into two separate legal communities, and given the small population and harsh circumstances, that meant on the verge of tearing itself apart. Both sides agreed, after long argument, to let Þorgeir decide. He went into his booth. He lay down. He pulled his wool cloak over his face, and for a full day and a night, he did not move and did not speak. When at last he came out, he announced his decision. All of Iceland would, from that day, be officially Christian. Old religious practices could continue in private if quietly done. There would be one law and one people. The assembly accepted his ruling. The country did not split, and the Norse world had, in one of its furthest outposts, formally crossed the threshold from the old gods to the new. In Thorfinn's old fjord, and we should now imagine that, with the long telescope of historical reflection, we can look ahead 130 years from the Tuesday evening we left him sleeping. The same long process is underway. Thorfinn himself, of course, is long dead. So is Sigrid. Halldor, the boy who looked at the gap at the mouth of the fjord, did indeed sail through it, and made a modest fortune, and came home, and died at 67 of an ordinary illness that, in our time, would not have killed him. Eyvind farmed the farm and died at 51. Aslaug, the 4-year-old who was learning to card wool by the loom, the one we said in part 2 might live to see most of it, lived to be 74, married twice, raised 11 children, of whom 7 survived to adulthood, and was buried in the year 935 in a small Christian churchyard on the south side of a stave church that her grandsons had helped to build. She had been baptized in her 60s. Her grandsons, by the time of her funeral, had never poured milk into a bowl for the Usvayatir. They had heard the stories. They no longer did the thing. The conversion of the Norse world to Christianity is not, contrary to a common simplification, a sudden event. It is a long, slow weave that runs across more than 2 centuries, and that takes very different forms in different regions. In Denmark, the royal conversion comes in the 960s under King Harald Bluetooth. The same Harald, by the small accident of modern technology, whose initials now sit on every wireless device in your household. In Norway, the conversion is forced through with considerable violence by the kings Olav Tryggvason and Olav Haraldsson, the second of whom, killed in battle in 1030, will be canonized as Saint Olav and become the patron saint of the country. In Iceland, as we have just seen, it is decided by a law speaker lying under his cloak in a booth at Þingvellir. In Sweden, it takes longest of all, and the last public sacrifices at the great pagan temple of Uppsala are still being recorded into the 1100s. But by the time of the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the conventional closing date of the Viking Age, almost the entire Norse world, is, at least formally, Christian. The carved dragons survive. They wind around the doorways of the new wooden churches. The old animal art does not die. It becomes the visible decoration of the new faith. The end of the Viking Age, by long convention, is dated to a particular battle on a particular September afternoon in the year 1066. The Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, a man who had himself served in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople 30 years earlier, and whose career is, in many ways, the perfect summary of everything the Norse world had become, landed in eastern England with a great fleet, hoping to claim the English throne. He was defeated by the English king Harold Godwinson at a place called Stamford Bridge on the River Derwent, just outside the city of York. Harald Hardrada was killed in the action. The bulk of his army was destroyed. The survivors went home in just 24 of the 300 ships that had carried them across the North Sea. 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson himself would be killed at Hastings by the Norman Duke William, and England would pass to a Norman dynasty whose own ancestors had, 2 centuries earlier, been Viking raiders settled in northern France. The story closes, in other words, by folding back on itself. The men who killed the last great Viking king were the descendants of the first wave of Vikings. The Norse world had not, in any meaningful sense, disappeared. It had become Europe. Chapter 20. Endings and the Hour by the Hearth. We are going to leave them, now, the way we found them. Thorfinn and Sigrid and Halldor and Eyvind and Aslaug, sleeping under wool and sheepskin in a turf-walled longhouse on the western coast of Norway, on a Tuesday evening in late autumn in the year 870. Ulf and Hild on the lower platform, sharing a single sheepskin, the fire banked, the lamp out, the wind moving very softly somewhere outside. They will wake before dawn. Sigrid will set the porridge. Thorfinn will go down to the spring. The cow that was lame will, today or tomorrow, be sound. The barley will, in another few weeks, come down from the upper field. The cloth on the loom will be a few more inches longer. The thought about Ingolfr's ship, set down on a high shelf this morning, will be a little heavier this evening than it was last evening, and a little heavier still the evening after that. And somewhere around midsummer of next year, when the boats are loaded on a strand 400 miles to the south, Thorfinn and Sigrid will not, in the end, be on them. Thorfinn's family will stay in their fjord for one more generation. It will be Aslaug's grandchildren who finally cross the water. They will land in 896 on the western coast of Iceland in a small turf-roofed longhouse built by their fathers, looking out at a snow-streaked mountain across a wide, pale green valley. The man on Gotland, with his 2 oak chests and his 14,000 coins, and his single set of footprints leading away into the snow, never came back. We know now, as much as we can know it, why. We know about the silver and how it traveled. We know about the rivers and the portars and the long courtyards on the southern Caspian. We know about Astrid's bronze scale and Sigrid's loom and Hild's quiet hands. We know about the Longships and the Knerrer, and the women whose 3 years of weaving caught the wind on every dragon prow that has ever entered a European harbor. We know about Ingolfr and his pillars, and his small wife Halvey, and the smoky bay that would become a capital city. We know about Thorgir on the Law Rock, and Harold at Stamford Bridge, and the carved cross over the doorway of the Stave Church. And we know, in the end, that the man on Gotland is not really one man. He is 14,000 small silver decisions made by farmers and traders and widows and weavers across 3 centuries and 3,000 miles. He is the small, careful gesture of a hand at a spring at dawn, and the small, careful weighing of a coin on a bronze scale in Hedeby, and the small, careful look between a husband and a wife across a long oak table when a stranger says, "Settlers." He is the ordinary work of ordinary people, accumulating, generation after generation, into something that looks, only from the right distance, like history. This is, in the end, what the Viking Age was. Not a few decades of dragon-proud terror on the coasts of Christendom, not a heroic age of warrior kings with names that still sell paperback novels. Those things existed. They mattered. But they were the foam on top of a much deeper, much slower, much more ordinary current. The current was farms. The current was looms. The current was small fishing boats lifting 2 cod out of a fjord at dawn, and small workshop doorways in trading towns, and small turf-walled longhouses on islands far to the west, and small assemblies in forest clearings where men in plain wool argued about pigs. The current was women like Sigrid and Hild and Astrid and Halvey, whose names, when they survive at all, survive only in fragments, but whose work is the substrate on which everything else stood. The current was thralls like Ulf and Hild, and the unnamed woman drawing water from the well at the end of an alley in Hedeby, whose suffering paid for much of what we call the wealth of the period, and whom an honest history must keep visible. The current was the sea, and the rivers, and the cold, patient north wind that filled a square wool sail off a Norwegian coast in the year 870. If any of you have ancestors from Scandinavia, or from the British Isles where the Norse settled, or from Iceland, where their language and their law tradition survive in almost direct descent into our own century, and many of you watching tonight you are, in some small genealogical way, the descendant of these households, not mostly of the men in the dragon-proud ships, of the men and women on the farms, of the loom and the hearth and the small bowl of milk on the ledge by the door. The famous parts of the Viking story were a small bright thread woven through a vast, slow, quiet cloth. And the cloth is what most of your ancestors were actually making, day in and day out, for several hundred years. If tonight's journey stirred memories of grandparents who spoke of the old country, of family stories about who came from where and when and why, of farms you knew or worked on yourself, where the rhythm of dawn chores and evening mending still ran the same way it ran in Thorfinn's longhouse, I would be honored if you shared them in the comments. Your generation, more than any to follow, still carries that long thread of practical handwork and family memory in living form. Those of you who served in the merchant marine, who fished commercially in cold northern waters, who learned a craft from an older man who could feel by the small adjustments of a tool what no manual could ever describe you, too, are part of the inheritance we have been talking about. Your perspective is irreplaceable, and the comment section is yours. The man on Gotland never came back. The silver lay under his wall for 1,029 years. The wind moved across the field, and the snow fell, and the snow melted, and the spring came, and the barley grew. and the farm changed hands, and the wall stood. And under it, all that time, were the small worn coins of a world we have spent the last several hours trying to make visible to you, a world of looms and longships, of springs and stockfish, of crowded longhouses and quiet courtyards on the southern shore of the Caspian, of a 4-year-old learning to card wool by firelight, while her father told a story about a whale. Now rest well. The fire is banked. The lamp is out. The wind has dropped. And in the quiet of history, their voices still echo, if we are willing to listen. I'll see you in the next one.